The Roman story of how kings ended begins with an outrage and an oath. In the traditional account, the last monarch, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, had climbed to power by force, ruled without consulting the Senate, and leaned on Etruscan allies and a palace guard more than on Roman consent. The final spark, remembered with ritual clarity, was the assault of the king's son on Lucretia, a noblewoman whose public plea for justice and subsequent death became the city's moral fulcrum. Lucius Junius Brutus, until then a cautious aristocrat, lifted a knife still red with the moment's pathos and swore, in words later Romans would memorize, that no man would ever again be king in Rome. An oath became a constitution. In 509 BC, Tarquin was expelled, his family and retainers driven into exile, and the city confronted a practical problem: how to replace the simple geometry of one sovereign with a pattern complicated enough to restrain ambition but efficient enough to govern. The solution the Romans crafted was less a blueprint than a set of balancing acts: annual magistracies to prevent entrenchment, collegiality, at least 2 officials sharing each high office to prevent unilateral action, and layered assemblies to ensure the people's voice could, in theory, correct elite overreach. The Senate, an advisory council of ex-magistrates, did not vanish with the monarchy. It grew in authority, the city's memory and deliberative center, even as formal sovereignty was said to rest with the citizen body. At the apex of ordinary power stood 2 consuls. Elected yearly, they inherited the king's imperium divided between them: command of armies, the right to summon the Senate and assemblies, the power to execute laws. Each consul could veto the other, a built-in check that turned decision-making into a practice duet. They wore the toga praetexta with its purple border and were preceded by lictors bearing fasces, bundles of rods, and outside the pomerium, an axe, symbolizing authority. Yet even here the Republic embedded limits. A consul who left office faced accountability. Extraordinary powers such as the dictatorship were temporary by statute, 6 months at most, and justified only by emergencies declared publicly. Beneath the consuls a ladder of offices, the cursus honorum, structured careers and ambition. Quaestors managed finances and archives. Aediles policed markets, streets, and games. Praetors dispensed justice and could command in the consul's absence. Censors, elected every 5 years, conducted the census, reviewed the Senate's membership, and supervised public morals and contracts. Each step was time-boxed and, for much of the Republic, separated by mandatory intervals, forcing patience on rising politicians and creating a civic rhythm in which no office was destiny. Law and legitimacy, however, were never purely the Senate's to dispense. From the beginning, the Roman people, Populus Romanus, were woven into the constitutional fabric through assemblies. The Comitia Centuriata, organized by military centuries and weighted toward wealth, elected the highest magistrates and decided on war and peace. The Comitia Tributa, organized by geography, passed laws and elected lower magistrates. Voting was indirect. Citizens fell into units that cast a single collective vote, and took place within ritual boundaries under auspices. In form and feeling, legislation was theater and divination intertwined. Magistrates proposed, priests scanned omens, citizens assented or withheld. The early republic also carried a seed of conflict that would shape its first 2 centuries: the strain between patricians, lineages claiming sacral seniority and political privilege, and plebeians, the broader body of citizens excluded at first from many magistracies and priesthoods. The new order delivered liberty, but not yet equity. Debts, land distribution, and legal opacity pressed hard on the majority. Beginning in the 5th century BC, plebeians withdrew from the city in a secession that threatened Rome's very capacity to field an army. The compromise was radical: the creation of tribunes of the plebs, sacrosanct officials elected by the plebeian assembly with the power of auxilium, to protect citizens from magistrates, and intercessio, to veto acts they deemed harmful. The Republic thus armed a counter-magistracy whose authority derived not from senatorial lineage or auspices but from the people's oath to defend their champions' persons. Clarity in law followed agitation. In the mid-5th century BC, Rome codified core civil rules on bronze, the 12 Tables, so that justice no longer lived only in elite memory. Though parts of the code were harsh, debt bondage was curbed only later. The act of inscription mattered. It made procedure legible, appealable, and in time, reformable. Subsequent settlements. The Licinio section laws opening the consulship to plebeians, the Hortensian law making plebiscites binding on all Romans, took the constitution's initial balances and tightened them, distributing power across class lines without dissolving the aristocracy's cultural primacy. Militarily, the infant republic had to survive the very exiles it had created. Tarquin sought restoration with Etruscan aid. Early battles tested Rome's walls, alliances, and trust in its improvised order. The figure of the citizen soldier became central. Men who voted in centuries also mustered in centuries, paying for their kit and defending a polity they now felt was theirs. Hero stories. Horatius at the bridge, Mucius Scaevola before an Etruscan king, served as constitutional parables. Individual boldness, yes, but always in defense of a collective oath. Religion, too, was constitution. Priests took auspices before votes. Prodigies halted assemblies. Magistrates bore not just power but ritual obligations. Yet the monarchy's collapse had severed no friendship with the gods. It had merely redistributed the conversation. Colleges, the pontiffs, augurs, and decemviri sacris faciendis, became repositories of sacred law, consulted by magistrates and senate alike. In this way the Republic wrapped the divine around delay, requiring omens to be favorable before policy could proceed, and making patience a civic virtue no less than courage. If the story sounds tidy, it wasn't. Violence intruded early. Brutus himself sentenced his own sons for plotting with the exiled king, an icy demonstration that the oath against monarchy outranked blood. And while the Republic vowed no kings, it quickly found that emergencies tempted Rome back toward concentrated power. The dictatorship, a single magistrate appointed for a narrow task, was used sparingly and, in the classical era, relinquished punctually. That habit of stepping down became a talisman Romans would later measure themselves against, with Sulla and Caesar as the negative mirrors. Still, by the close of its first century the Republic had achieved something rare. A system that made ambition climb ladders instead of walls, that made power share a bench, that made laws visible, appeals possible, and armies citizen-owned. It created offices that expired and honors that circulated, enough hierarchy to get things done, enough participation to defend the result. The monarchy's expulsion had not delivered democracy in a modern sense, but it had birthed a mixed constitution, part aristocratic council, part popular sovereignty, part annual magistracy, that could expand without shattering, adapt without forgetting, and teach generation after generation that the most Roman sentence began with, "We have decided," not, "I will." Rome's new republic did not spring into equality. It crawled there over centuries, scuffing its knees on class. On one side stood the patres, patricians, houses that claimed seniority in law and right, guardians of auspices, monopolists of the most sacral and most prestigious magistracies. On the other stood the plebs, the vast remainder of citizens, smallholders, artisans, traders, freedmen, and their descendants, men who fought and paid taxes but found doors closed when they reached for the levers of policy. The Romans later wrapped this tension in a tidy phrase, contentio ordinum, the struggle of the orders. In reality it was a stop-start negotiation, part strike, part law reform, part cultural mixing, through which Rome learned to translate social weight into constitutional change. Debt lit the fuse. The early 5th century BC was hard on small farmers. Campaign seasons cut into planting, neighbors raided, and lean harvests turned loan contracts into shackles. The instrument was nexum, a bond that, in its harshest forms, could reduce a defaulting debtor to something like indentured servitude. Stories survive a veteran's chain for arrears while still bearing scars from Rome's wars, parables with a purpose. When the city needed those same men under arms, they had leverage, and in 494 BC, the plebeians used it. They withdrew en masse to a hill outside Rome. Later myth made it the Mons Sacer, refusing to muster until the elite promised relief. What emerged from that first secession was an office unlike any other in the Mediterranean, the tribuni plebis, tribunes of the plebs. Elected not by the whole people but by the plebeians assembled in their own body, the concilium plebis, tribunes embodied a covenant. The plebs swore to defend their persons, sacrosanctitas. In return, tribunes swore to defend plebeians from magistrates' abuses, auxilium, and to obstruct harmful acts, intercessio. With no lictors and no imperium, tribunes nonetheless carried the most powerful word in Roman politics, veto, because the city had decided to honor it. Even patrician magistrates who sneered in private learned that ignoring a tribune could trigger another secession, and with it, paralysis. Secession became a recurring grammar of protest. A generation later, constitutional improvisation collided with abuse in the episode of the Decemviri, 451 to 449 BC. 10 men appointed to compile and publish Rome's laws. Their first year produced 10 bronze tables, an achievement. Their second year, dominated by Appius Claudius Clique, produced 2 more and something uglier, as the board clung to power beyond its term. The story the Romans told, of Appius' attempt to seize the maiden Virginia and her father's desperate knife, ends with another plebeian withdrawal, this time to the Aventine, and the restoration of regular magistrates. The settlement that followed mattered. The Valerio-Horatian laws, 449 BC, recognized the sacrosanctity of tribunes in statute, reopened appeal, provocatio, from magistrates' coercive acts to the people, and, critically, acknowledged the force of plebeian assembly resolutions, at least when ratified. Rome had carved a new artery into its constitution. Bottom-up commands could enter the body politic, provided procedures were observed. Law gave the struggle its map, but culture and kinship redrew it. A ban on intermarriage between patricians and plebeians, one of the more odious provisions of the 12 Tables, fell in 445 BC with the passage of the Lex Canulia. That reform did more than bless weddings. It let prestige flow across the boundary. Children of mixed unions could claim both the social capital of noble lineage and the political energy of the plebs. Around the same time, compromise on office titles, military tribunes with consular power in some years, offered plebeians an avenue toward higher command, if still blocked from the consulship itself. The long fight for the consulship became a symbol. In 367 BC, after a sustained campaign led by plebeian tribunes Gaius Licinius Stolo and Lucius Sextius Lateranus, a package, the Licinio-Sextian laws, passed. They attacked debt abuses, capped holdings of public land, ager publicus, and most memorably, mandated that one of the 2 consuls each year could be a plebeian. In 366, Sextius himself took office as the first plebeian consul. The cursus honorum followed suit. Plebeians gained access to the praetorship and curule aedileship, and later to priesthoods long hoarded by patrician colleges. A generation of talented men from the plebeian nobility, nobiles now, because nobilitas in Rome meant no, that is, remembered on the list of magistrates, stepped into leadership and did what leaders do in Rome, commanded armies, celebrated triumphs, carved their names into public memory. None of this dissolved class overnight. The elite adapted cleverly. Patricians who wished to keep their club exclusive concentrated on sacred prestige and old alliances. Practical politicians intermarried, mentored promising plebeians, and built something new, a blended ruling stratum of nobiles that included both patrician gentes and plebeian houses ennobled by office. The game's shape changed. Its stakes did not. Clientage, personal bonds between patrons and clients, wove the city tighter. Plebeians gained champions. Patricians gained followings beyond their birth group. The assemblies learned to respond to names rather than merely to orders. Meanwhile, the plebeian institutions matured. Alongside the tribunes stood plebeian aediles to manage archives, markets, and often, the practical mechanisms of tribunes' power. The concilium plebis developed its own styles of debate, Conti ones, informal addresses, swayed opinion, proposed plebiscita moved to votes. At first, those resolutions required senatorial blessing to bind all Romans. But the logic of the system kept pulling toward parity. The Lex Publilia, 339 BC, strengthened popular legislation. The Lex Hortensia, 287 BC, passed in another moment of secession under the dictator Quintus Hortensius, completed the arc. Plebiscites, passed by the plebeians alone, would henceforth bind the entire community without further ratification. The Republic had accepted that the people's part could speak for the whole. If debt began the struggle, land made sure it never quite ended. The wars that knit Italy into a Roman sphere also produced ager publicus, state land distributed for use. Elite families, with their capital and reach, often occupied vast tracts. Tribunes with agrarian agendas, famously the Gracchi in the late 2nd century BC, would later revive the old Licinian cap and try to restore smallholders. Even in the Middle Republic, agrarian tensions seasoned elections and trials. The class settlement prevented the Republic from shattering. It could not make Rome immune to inequality. Religion, too, yielded and held. The highest priesthoods, the Pontifex Maximus and Major Flaminate, were patrician preserves until the 3rd century, when laws opened them to plebeians and plebeian, new men, began to occupy even the most ancient sanctuaries. Yet ritual remained a language elites spoke fluently. Auspices could halt assemblies on technical grounds. Prodigies could demand expiations that conveniently delayed bills. Tribunes were not powerless in this theater. They could convene and hold below the patricians' ritual skyline, but sacred procedure never stopped mattering. The city's spaces remembered the struggle. The Aventine Hill became a plebeian emblem, home to the temple of the Aventine Triad series, Liber, Libera, where plebeian records, including the decrees of their assembly, were kept. The Forum, where patrician houses and curule chairs crowded, was the theater where tribunes stationed themselves on benches, ready to intercept magistrates or summon concio. Even topography encoded compromise. Tribunes could not enter the Senate house uninvited in the archaic period, but they could sit at the door and threaten veto. Later practice brought them inside, a sign that the orders had learned, however uneasily, to legislate in the same room. Historians still argue about the struggle's exact contours. Were patrician and plebeian originally legal castes or looser status groups that hardened into law? How early did intermarriage bans bite? Did the 12 tables reflect plebeian victory or patrician codification? Was Nexum truly abolished by statute around 326 BC, the Lex Poetelia Papiria, or did debt bondage simply mutate into subtler forms? Skeptics warn that our sources, Livy Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writes centuries later, projecting republican anxieties backward. Optimists point to the institutional trail. Tribunes are very real. Plebiscites become law. The consul list fills with plebeian names. Between the lines of legend, a constitutional history remains legible. What is clear is the Republic's genius for turning rupture into routine. A strike became an office became a veto, at first scandal, became a lubrication that kept resentments from seizing the engine. The patriciate learned to share honor without surrendering identity. Plebeians learned to operate the republic's machines rather than simply push against them. By the 3rd century BC, when Rome faced Pyrrhus and then Carthage, the city fought not as a factional camp but as a layered polity whose poor, middling, and wealthy all saw their stake in the outcome. The contentio ordinum had not abolished privilege, it had woven it into a broader fabric, thick enough to bear imperial weight. You can hear the settlement in Rome's political vocabulary. Nobilitas meant, no, a reputation earned through office, whether patrician or plebeian. Concordia ordinum, harmony of the orders, became an ideal politicians invoked as they courted crowds. People, populace, senate, senatus, and Romanus, fused into that famous formula SPQR, stamped on deeds and standards alike. The letters didn't erase class, they made it collaborative. Out of the quarrel over who counted came a constitution that counted everyone enough to conquer. Before Rome could imagine seas as moats, it had to learn hills as classrooms. The peninsula's ridges, valleys, and stubborn neighbors taught the Republic the politics of patience and the logistics of persuasion, the kind done with treaties measured in spears and milestones. Between the late 6th and early 3rd centuries BC, Latin allies, Etruscan cities, Highland Samnites, and Greek tar-flavored poleis in the south all tested the Roman experiment. What emerged was not just a bigger map but a new kind of federation, Rome at the hub with spokes of road, law, and obligation binding Italy into a machine that could later run an empire. Start with the king closest at hand. The Latins, cousins by language and cult, had long shared festivals with Rome at the sanctuary of Jupiter Latiaris on the Alban Mount. In the 5th and 4th centuries BC, cooperation alternated with rivalry. A Latin league of towns tried to keep Rome first among equals rather than simply first. After the Gallic sack of Rome ca. 390 BC, an episode that frightened memory into parable, Rome rebuilt, fortified, and reasserted leadership. The decisive settlement came after the Latin War, 340 to 338 BC, when Rome defeated a coalition led by Tusculum and other league towns. Rather than fold everyone into one bland citizenship, or keep them all outside, Rome invented gradations. Some communities received full citizenship without the vote. Others full citizenship integrated into tribes. Still others became socii, allies bound by treaty to supply troops but governed locally. The Latin League dissolved, the foedus treaty became Rome's preferred verb. Those gradients mattered. Roman citizenship became a currency that could be minted in fractions. A community that behaved might, in a generation, see its status improved. One that rebelled risked demotion or dispersion. Colonies, not mass migrations but garrison towns with allotments to Roman and Latin settlers, shored up coasts and roads. Antium, Callus, Frigeli, later Lyciria and Venusia. These outposts, placed like thumbtacks on Italy's map, secured river mouths and passes while offering land to veterans and the poor. They were Rome's polite way of saying, "We live here now," in places that had previously phrased the matter differently. The highlands offered a different syllabus. The Samnites, hill peoples of south-central Italy, fought like their landscape, flexible, fast, hard to pin. 3 Samnite wars, traditionally 343 to 341, 327 to 304, and 298 to 290 BC, taught Rome humility and then doctrine. The famous humiliation at the Caudine Forks, 321 BC, became the Republic's cautionary tale. Trapped in a mountain pass near modern Benevento, a Roman army was forced to pass under the yoke. 2 spears upright, one across, symbolically disarmed and sent home on parole. The Senate refused to ratify the shameful treaty. The unlucky consuls were handed over to the Samnites in expiation, and Rome returned to the hills with fewer assumptions and more scouts. Out of those campaigns came the Roman love affair with roads as instruments of strategy. In 312 BC, Censor Appius Claudius Caecus began the Via Appia, a stone promise running straight from Rome toward Capua and, eventually, Brundisium on the Adriatic. Roads let heavy infantry arrive where mountain folk expected delay. They made supply a matter of schedule rather than prayer. The Via Valeria extended east. The Via Flaminia later would stitch the north. Milestones marked not just distance but Roman insistence. Each MP quiet boast that the city could move thought into gravel and gravel into law.at the same time. Rome adjusted its military grammar. The old hoplite phalanx, tight ranks of citizens with long spears, had been splendid on flat farms and less splendid on Italian unevenness. In the 4th century, whether by borrowing from Samnite practice or independent evolution, historians still circle this chicken or egg. Rome shifted toward maniples, small, flexible units arranged in a checkerboard, quincunx, that could bend, relieve, and climb. Young hostati, steadier principes, and veteran triarii could rotate through the fighting line like well-drilled waves, while light velites skirmished and pestered. The legion became less a wall and more a set of hinges, and Italy's slopes ceased to be the enemy's ally. Etruscan cities, once royal patrons and rivals, led into this order by war and accommodation. Veii fell earlier, 396 BC, after a long siege, its absorption doubling Roman territory north of the Tiber. Later campaigns pressed Tarquinii, Volsinii, and others into treaties. Some Etruscan elites discovered the franchise was a fine instrument for continuing to be important in Latin. Roman elites discovered Etruscan ritual and engineering were fine things to collect. Augury and drain building never go out of style. The South, studded with Greek colonies, Magna Graecia, posed the kind of problem that writes itself into speeches. Wealthy cities like Tarentum resented Roman entry into their maritime politics. Romans, priding themselves on treaties and on not being told to turn their ships around, took offense when Tarentine Democrats sank a Roman squadron. Tarentum invited a celebrity general, Pyrrhus of Epirus, a kinsman of Alexander by ambition if not by bloodline, to play champion. In 280 to 275 BC, Pyrrhus wore elephants taught Romans new zoological vocabulary. His victories at Heraclea and Asculum impressed nobody's supply officers, and his costly success gave the world a phrase, Pyrrhic victory, for winning yourself poorer. When Pyrrhus decamped to Sicily and back again, the Roman machine, provincial and stubborn, ground on. Tarentum fell. Greek cities found that Roman citizenship, roads, and reasonably predictable courts made for tolerable new normals. All the while, Rome's settlement method showed an odd genius, severed the capacity for coordinated resistance without erasing local pride. Allies retained their councils, gods, and dialects. They sent troops under Roman command, not as conquered subjects but as partners who paid in blood and received in security. The socii formed the backbone of Roman armies, sometimes in numbers rivaling Roman citizens. In return, they shared in triumphs, reflected glory, and, in the long run, sought the gold at the end of Rome's rainbow, the vote. Quirky tidbit: those milestones you imagine as solemn stones were sometimes recycled altarpieces, tomb markers, or snapped columns. Rome was practical even in piety. And Appius Claudius, the road's namesake, also reformed Latin literature by sponsoring public performances. He went blind, tradition says, and still managed to irritate posterity with oratory. Rome did not conquer only with legions and limestone. Hostages, preferably aristocrats, traveled to Rome as living guarantors of treaties, discovering Latin grammar and Roman manners at the same time. marriages cross-stitched elites. Markets pulled hill produced downhill and coastal luxuries inland. The city handed out citizenship in slivers and wedges. Civitas sin suffragio, citizenship without the vote, gave legal protection and tax obligations without political teeth, a status that could be, tantalizingly, upgraded. In this way Rome turned the demand for rights into an instrument of quiet conquest. Historians still argue over timing and motive. Did the Manipular Legion evolve due to Samnite pressure or internal experimentation? Was the Caudine humiliation as ritualized as Livy paints it, or later dramatized to teach caution? Were Latin war settlements strategic genius or improvisation hardened into policy by success? Archaeology supplements annals. Fort lines, road courses, cemetery shifts reveal a pattern of colonization and alliance that doesn't always match the speeches. Yet even the skeptics grant that by 270 BC Rome had stitched Italy from Arno to Strait of Messina into a garment that fit her ambitions snugly. The legal architecture kept pace. Municipal charters, later leges coloniae, standardized local institutions, duovirii, two-man magistracies, aediles, and local senates mirrored the Roman model in miniature. Tax and levy obligations were measured in formulae that accountants could love. Military logistics matured into habit. Each campaign season saw levies, marching camps thrown up in standardized rectangles, castra with ditches and ramparts, and winter quarters that could double as seeds for permanent towns. Maps didn't exist as we know them, but the road system functioned as a memory you could walk. Light joke 1. Romans joked. If Romans joked the way Livy claims, that the Via Appia was so straight because Claudius had bribed the hills to move. Failing that, his surveyor bribed the copyists. In truth, the road bends enough to make any draftsman nod approvingly at compromise. A final Italian test combined everything. The Bellum Sociale, the social war of 91 to 88 BC, erupted when Italian allies, tired of paying in sons without voting in Rome, revolted. It lies outside our current century, but it shows the long-term pressure built into Rome's graded citizenship. The settlement, citizenship for those who laid down arms and soon, for the rest, completed the slow process begun after the Latin War. Italy, in legal fact as well as practical dependence, became Roman. When Marius, Sulla, and later Caesar mobilized legions, they drew on a citizenry far beyond the city's walls, a human reservoir filled by centuries of calibrated inclusion. So when, after Pyrrhus, Rome looked across to Sicily and met Carthage in the First Punic War, she did not do so as a city dabbling in oversea adventures. She did so as the capital of a dense Italian commonwealth, roads radiating, colonies anchoring, allies enrolled, law portable, and an army culture that could replace losses and learn new tricks on campaign. The Republic's Italian century had taught it to survive humiliation without panic, to turn victories into administrations, and to use citizenship not as a wall but as a ladder. Light joke 2. Somewhere on the Via Appia a muleteer swore that Rome's true empire was over his back. A censor fined him for insolence. A poet later agreed with the muleteer and blamed the censor's shoes. If the classroom metaphor holds. Italy gave Rome the curriculum, Latin grammar, alliances, geometry, roads, rhetoric, treaties, and gymnasium, legions. Exams were unexpected, forked passes, hired kings, winter rains, but by 264 BC the student had become the invigilator. Rome had learned how to make neighbors into co-authors, to keep local pride humming beneath a Roman chorus, and to march in straight lines that mattered because they ended in laws, not just in walls. Historians still argue, as historians must, whether this was inevitable. Could another Latin city have done it? Might a different Caudine forks have broken Roman politics instead of hardening it? Counterfactuals aside, the record shows a polity that kept retooling itself to match terrain and temperament. When the Punic horizon opened, Rome stepped onto ships with the muscle memory of a peninsula conquered by patience. Italy had been the workshop, the Mediterranean would be the showroom. And the Republic, still calling itself a city, already moved like a country. If Rome's constitution were a machine you could stand beside and admire, the part that moves most visibly is its calendar. Power does not sit, it rotates. Office in the Republic is a season, and magistrates are weather fronts sweeping through the year, each charged to do something necessary before they yield to the next. The rhythm is deliberate, annuality to prevent tyranny, collegiality to prevent loneliness, hierarchy to prevent chaos, and a ladder to give ambition a path that is not a wall. At the summit of the ordinary year stand the consuls, 2, never 1, elected by the comitia centuriata. They inherit the city's imperium, that elastic Roman word that means both command and the right to compel. Imperium has edges. It is greater, maius, or lesser, minus, than someone else's, valid inside the sacred boundary, pomerium, for civil coercion, and outside it for war. A consul can summon the Senate, propose laws, preside over assemblies, and when the gates of war are open, lead legions. Yet he is shadowed by a rival equal in power. Each consul can veto the other's act, the governance equivalent of a built-in second thought. Romans preferred that decision look like a conversation, not a drumbeat. Below and beside the consuls run tracks of specialized authority. Praetors handle justice as consuls without the theater. The praetor urbanus judges cases between citizens. The praetor peregrinus manages suits where foreigners breathe the same air as Romans. They carry imperium too, enough to command provincial armies or govern in the consul's absence. Their greatest invention is not a verdict but a vocabulary. Each year a praetor publishes an edictum, a program of remedies he will grant. Over time those edicts accrete into a usable law of contracts, property, and procedure. Roman private law's living code, updated annually by men who know that precedent and practicality are cousins, not twins. Aediles keep the city from tripping over itself. The plebeian pair, born as attendants to the tribunes, and the curule pair, open to patricians and plebeians, police markets, waits, and street obstructions, maintain temples, roads, and sewers, and stage games whose splendor can make or break political futures. They find bakers for dishonest loaves, clear collapsed porticos, bargain for grain in a shortage, and sign contracts for public works, which gives them the informal power to know who builds and who owes favors. Their insignia, curule chairs sometimes, are less important than their clipboards. Quaestors are the Republic's treasurers and archivists. They manage the aerarium, state treasury, in the temple of Saturn, audit generals' accounts, escort governors with cash chests, and keep the tablets that remember what was paid and by whom. A career often begins here. A quaestor's good memory is a passport into the Senate, which by custom enrolls those who have held curule office. To be dull and accurate in this role is not a flaw, it is a recommendation. Censors are Rome's periodic conscience. Elected every 5 years, they serve a term much shorter than their office's long shadow. They conduct the census, classifying citizens into centuries for military and voting duty, repair public morals, regimen morum, lease public contracts, and can revise the Senate's role, removing men who have disgraced their dignity by scandal or extravagance. The censor's staff, the scribe's pen, and the public contracts auctioned by locatio shape the city's resources in ways louder offices can only envy. No imperium here, only authority, auctoritas, concentrated into a list. To be dropped from the Senate by censors is to feel the Republic's frown in your bones. And then there are offices that guard the Constitution from below. Tribunes of the plebs, 10 by the Middle Republic, can veto the acts of magistrates, halt legislation, convene the plebeian assembly, and bring prosecutions in defense of the people. Their bodies are sacrosanct, To harm one is to invite religious and political catastrophe. Their bench at the edge of the forum is a physical reminder that power in Rome is always negotiable. All of this rides a ladder, the cursus honorum, that tells ambitious men, and in the last generation of the Republic, the occasional woman behind the scenes, how to climb without setting the building on fire. After quaestorship, a man may seek the aedileship, optional but useful, then praetorship, then consulship. Intervals, leges annalis, separate steps so that experience accumulates and charisma cools. Age minimums, formalized in the 2nd century BC, keep boys from sprinting past senators who remember both their birthdays and their blunders. Mainstream fact, tidy as a fastidious scribe, 2 consuls elected annually, praetors, eventually as many as 8, with jurisdictional and provincial assignments, aediles, 2 plebeian, 2 curule, for markets and games, quaestors, rising from 4 to 20 under Sulla for finance, censors every 5 years, tribunes 10, with veto power, all backed by the Senate's advisory decrees, senatus consulta, which acquire the force of habit if not formal law. Elections cluster in the Campus Martius. Magistrates take auspices, lictors bear fasces, vetoes cross the forum like weather fronts, and the calendar, fasti carved in stone, names so future Romans can measure themselves against them. The Republic hides an emergency button in the drawer, the dictatorship. In crisis, on senatorial advice, a consul can nominate a dictator for a specific task, quelling a revolt, holding elections, fighting a war, limited to 6 months. A master of horse, magister equitum, serves as his deputy. In the classical period, dictators like Cincinnatus obey the timer, job done, office resigned, plow resumed. Later, the button sticks. Sulla and Caesar press it into a new shape that breaks the drawer. In the machine's ideal form, however, extraordinary power is a bridge, not a residence. Quirky tidbit: magistrates carry a small box of sacred chickens, or, more precisely, have a Pilarius who does. Before an expedition or a major vote, auspices are taken. If the birds peck greedily, omens smile, tripudium solistimum. If they refuse, you either postpone or, as one rash commander did, throw them into the sea so they can drink. Spoiler: the gods notice the sarcasm. Another quirk: aediles sometimes stencil the names of defaulting contractors on amphorae used as urinals during the games. A Roman version of public shaming signage that smells like policy. Veto is Rome's speed governor. A tribune can rise and say, "I forbid," and a consul must sit down. A colleague can block a colleague. Even a lesser magistrate may threaten interruption. Critics call it sand in the gears. Admirers call it the Republic's way of ensuring that laws are not passed in a hurry just because someone had a good lunch. The Senate has no veto, but it has patience and purse strings. Magistrates who ignore its auctoritas find their budgets thin and their triumphs delayed. The Senate, though not a magistracy, is the machine's memory. Ex-magistrates fill its benches, censors curate them. Debates in the curia produce consulta that bind by expectation even when assemblies must pass the formal law. The Senate allocates provinces to consuls and praetors, votes on triumphs, negotiates with embassies, and whispers instructions to governors in letters that sound like advice and feel like orders. It cannot command legions, but it can withhold money and honor, which in Rome often amounts to the same. Historians still argue whether the Republic was truly a mixed constitution, as Polybius famously described, blending monarchy, consuls, aristocracy, senate, and democracy, people's assemblies, or whether that balance slid gradually toward aristocratic dominance as the Senate learned to manage elections, juries, and purse. Some see the tribunate's veto as a robust popular check. Others note how often tribunes become clients of great houses, their veto wielded to broker elite bargains. Did the annual churn democratize ambition or simply train the ambitious to gain the calendar? Debate lives in footnotes, and in court speeches where Cicero alternately praises the people and persuades them to prefer senatorial wisdom. The system works best when men respect its rituals. A consul announces a bill, takes auspices, hears objections, and submits to vote. A tribune watches for tyranny, not triumph. A praetor publishes an edict and then follows it himself. A governor departs for his province after taking an oath and returns to face audit. When ambition forgets choreography, the stage fills with elbows. Sulla's March on Rome, 88 BC, is the most notorious rehearsal for that amnesia. A consul who declines to accept a loss of command, a senate bullied by arms, proscriptions written like ledgers of revenge. Caesar's career will turn the exception into precedent. Augustus will later freeze the machine mid-rotation and call the ice restoration. Light joke 1. Romans like to say that aediles held office so citizens could complain professionally. Who will fix the pothole? The aedile. Who put the pothole there? Also the aedile. Light joke 2. The questor's ideal handwriting, it was said, could make debts smaller by looking unimpressed. A sloppy questor doubled the deficit with ink blots. Light joke 3. Candidates for aedile bribed the crowd with bigger games. Philosophers muttered that Rome had discovered a municipal proof of the paradox of choice. More panthers did not equal more virtue. The jurisdictional map thickens as the empire grows. Consuls no longer command only near Rome. They receive provinces, Spain, Macedonia, Africa, where imperium becomes travel-sized. Praetors overflow into new posts. Quaestors sprout like clerks in a bank with too many counters. Governors, with imperium militare and domi, become tiny republics on legs, checked by annuality in theory, by senatorial audits in practice, and by the hope of a triumph if they return rich in plunder and poor in excuses. The Republic stretches its calendar abroad and discovers that distance is a solvent that weakens annual glue. Yet for 2 centuries of expansion, the machine hums. Elections, games, lawsuits, censuses, tax leases, and triumph generals coexist. Tribunes veto, then negotiate. The Senate debates grain prices and Macedonian kings with equal relish. The fasti consulars, lists of consuls carved in stone, pile up like rings in a tree trunk. The Republic's boast is not that it never breaks. It is that it breaks predictably and mends with familiar tools. In that predictability, law quietly flowers. Praetorian edicts tame archaic forms, creating actions in fact where old writs suffocated. Aediles' edicts regulate market fraud. Censors' notes reshape mores into enforceable standards. The Republic's legal genius is procedural. If a form prevents justice, invent a fiction. If a fiction becomes shameless, write a new form. Year after year, magistrates push that evolution forward one docket at a time. And always, the calendar. On January 1st, the lictors shift from one doorway to another. Fasces transfer, bundles against new shoulders. Oaths are sworn on Capitol and in camps. Auspices are taken, edicts are posted. The city notices less the men than the movement. Office departs, office arrives, authority never forgets to end. It is a metaphysics of limits disguised as paperwork, and it educates citizens in the art of expecting to be asked again next year, not obeyed forever. Rome will eventually collide with careers larger than a calendar. But before that collision, the Republic's governance by magistrates creates habits an empire will inherit. That power likes partners, that law improves when it keeps receipts, that offices are costumes worn for a season, not skins grown for life. In that mechanical modesty lay the Republic's claim to be something more than a city with armies. It was a schedule with a soul. Before Rome knew how to write on water, Carthage had already filled half the Mediterranean with its signature. A Phoenician colonial success story turned maritime commonwealth, Carthage stitched Spain, North Africa, Sardinia, and western Sicily together with trade, treaties, and triremes that handled like arguments, quick, sharp, and uninterested in your feelings. Rome, land power par excellence, looked across the Sicilian straits and saw not only grain and markets but also a diploma it did not yet possess, a navy. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BC, began, as Roman wars often do, with a local quarrel that metastasized. Mercenaries called Mamertines, Italians turned freebooters, had seized Messana in Sicily and toggled between Carthaginian and Roman protection. When Rome finally chose to help, it discovered that helping in Sicily involved sailing. The Senate, allergic to ignorance, set about unlearning it. According to tradition, a captured Carthaginian quinquereme, 5-bank or arrangement by counting rowers per vertical file, not literal 5 decks, served as the model. Roman shipwrights allegedly built hundreds within a year, carpentry by template and stubbornness. If you're new to sea, you make the battle a land problem. Rome's solution was the corvus, the crow, a boarding bridge with a spike that dropped onto enemy decks, nailed them to yours, and turned naval maneuver into infantry wrestling. Early engagements rewarded the contraption. Miley, 260 BC, brought Rome her first naval laurel and a new office, Dux Classus, fleet commander, who staged a triumph with prows as trophies. But the sea teaches and punishes. The corvus made ships top-heavy. Storms learned to read Roman arrogance on the horizon and edit it. Entire fleets sank not in battle but in weather footnotes. Sicily became Rome's boot camp in risk, build, wreck, rebuild, adjust, and learn finally that seamanship and supply, not gadgets, win campaigns. By the war's late phase, Rome had absorbed the practical syllabus: train oarsmen, rotate crews, keep hulls caulked, and stop borrowing money from angry gods by launching in storm season. At the Aegates Islands, 241 BC, Roman squadrons, lighter, better trained, sails stripped for fighting, caught a Carthaginian fleet heavy with supply and defeated it cleanly. The peace ate Carthage's maritime teeth, Sicily ceded, indemnity imposed, and Rome, with suspicious briskness, annexed Sardinia and Corsica when a mercenary mutiny left Carthage distracted, an episode that still smells opportunistic even in Roman memoirs. Mainstream fact, tidy like a ship's ledger. The First Punic War lasted 23 grinding years, the longest in Roman history, ending with Rome's first overseas province, Sicily. The corvus featured early, fell out of favor, and Roman seamanship improved enough to win without it. Indemnities flowed to the aerarium, underwriting more fleets and a habit of asking the Mediterranean for receipts. The war's price, men, silver, timber, was vast. Its dividend was cognitive. Rome had learned that it could be a naval power when necessary, and that Sicily's grain could be a habit rather than a treat. Peace didn't idle ambition, it redirected it. Carthage, squeezed in the islands, looked to Iberia. Hamilcar Barca, then his son-in-law Hasdrubal, then his son Hannibal, shaped a Spanish empire of mines, markets, and tough infantry. Rome, watching with that blend of legalism and paranoia that becomes policy, signed treaties demarcating spheres. The Ebro River became line and omen. Saguntum, a Roman ally south of that line, became Spark. Hannibal, oath-ridden in childhood by family theater, a story the Romans adored recounting, besieged Saguntum. Rome demanded surrender. Carthage hesitated. War, second course, was served. Hannibal's march to Italy remains an act equal parts logistics and theater. Crossing the Pyrenees with a polyglot army, he bribed, bullied, and bargained his way through Gaul, then climbed into the Alps where mules suspected treason. Snow, narrow ledges, rock falls, hostile tribes. Livy gives you a symphony of miseries. But the strategic arithmetic is plain, appear where the enemy thinks geography is a cuirass. Hannibal carried elephants as morale and billboard. Most died of the same physics that humbled Romans at sea, but the survivors were worth a dozen speeches in the plains. Then the schooling. At the Ticinus and Trebia, 218 BC, then at Lake Trasimene, 217, Hannibal condensed ambush into textbook. At Cannae, 216, he wrote a diagram general's still sketch, a bowed center absorbing Roman mass, cavalry superiority rolling the wings, encirclement closing like a purse. Estimates vary, but the slaughter was municipal, tens of thousands of Romans and allies. The city trembled, the gods received emergency honors, and neighbors considered the benefits of being wrong. Rome's reply was not a genius but a temperament. Fabius Maximus, called Cunctator, the delayer, shadowed, scorched, and refused battle on Hannibal's terms. The Fabian strategy, attrition, harassment, denial of supplies, became a parable Romans later loved to hate and then, grudgingly, to respect. Quirky tidbit, Fabius' caution irritated Romans enough that they coined a verb, to fabiate, meaning to dither nobly, and mocked him with songs. When he saved legions by declining to be impressive, they coined gratitude. Another oddity, Hannibal allegedly carried jars of vinegar to soften rock for road cutting in the Alps. The chemistry is debated, the image immortal, Carthaginian sappers pouring salad dressing on the mountain. Rome rebuilt armies the way it rebuilds roofs, immediately. New levies, a lower property threshold to fill ranks, allied contingents compelled by treaty, an estate that could absorb 3 Kennies' worth of grief without fiscal collapse. The war widened into Spain and Sicily. Roman commanders learned to match Carthaginian elasticity with their own. In Spain, the Scipiones bled and taught. In Sicily, Archimedes briefly turned geometry into artillery before Syracuse fell. The Senate, normally slow, learned speed where grain and loyalty were concerned. Enter Publius Cornelius Scipio, later Africanus, the man who made boldness look like hindsight. As a young commander in Spain, he rebuilt Roman morale with victories at Becula and Ilipa, combining deception with discipline. Elected consul in 205 BC, he proposed the unthinkable: invade Africa to make Hannibal come home. The Senate muttered about rashness. Scipio, persuaded with logistics and charm, drilled volunteers in Sicily until they were rumor-resistant, and sailed. In Africa he courted Numidian allies, especially Massinissa, whose cavalry would become Rome's wind. When Hannibal finally returned, the two met at Zama, 202 BC. No perfect encirclement here. Instead, Scipio channeled elephants through lanes, let discipline and Numidian horse do their arithmetic, and won a clean verdict. Carthage sued for peace. Mainstream fact again. The peace stripped Carthage of empire, ships, except 10, and dignity. Indemnity scheduled its breath. War could not be declared without Roman permission. Spain became Rome's next workshop. 2 provinces with restless tribes and silver rivers. The Second Punic War revealed Roman recovery as a superpower, an ability to lose catastrophically and continue planning, a senate that could produce Fabians and Scipios in sequence. Allies who, despite defections, mostly stayed in the long queue called Fides. After Zama, Roman fear curdled into policy. When, decades later, Carthage defended itself against Numidian aggression without Rome's leave, a chorus in the Senate, Cato the Elder famous among them, sang the same closing line to every speech: Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. The Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BC, began as demand, escalated to siege, and ended in 3 days of street fighting that turned commerce into cinders. Scipio Aemilianus, adopted grandson of Africanus, watched his soldiers burn a civilization and quoted Homer through tears. The city was razed, its territory made the province of Africa, its memory used as a cautionary mirror for Roman pride dressed as safety. Historians still argue about everything delicious. Did the Corvus truly decide early naval battles, or did training? Were Hannibal's elephant numbers exaggerated to flatter Roman survivors? Was Fabius delaying strategy brilliant or inevitable after Trasimene? Did Scipio win Zama by genius or by Numidian timing? Was Carthage's final destruction strategic necessity or theatrical cruelty made into law? Plutarch, Polybius, Livy offer narratives. Archaeology adds grain contracts, sling bullets, harbor basins. Consensus shifts like a fleet tacking. What endures is the shape. A land power turns amphibious, absorbs defeats like oxygen, and emerges with provinces, taxation, and a taste for bays. Quirky tidbit 2. Sailors on Roman quinquiremes trained to the beat of a flute player. The triers had long known the value of music, so that 5 men on one oar pulled like a single large person with opinions about rhythm. Quirky tidbit 3. After Zama, Scipio's soldiers hailed him as Africanus. Roman culture, depressingly witty, later joked that if he'd lost, they'd have called him Chirpio, because disgrace his mouth quick. Light joke 1. A senator grumbled that the sea was just a road that refused to sit still. A censor fined him for contempt of infrastructure. Light joke 2. When a young noble bragged that he'd seen an elephant, an old farmer replied, "I've plowed one." A rustic way of telling the city to keep its metaphors honest. Light joke 3. Sailors swore the Corvus's spike had a taste for Carthaginian pine. Carpenters replied it had a taste for shipwright fingers. Consequences seeped everywhere. Provinces needed governors, courts, tax systems, and garrisons. Praetors multiplied. Quaestors learned Spanish numerals. Equestrian tax companies, publicani, discovered that harvesting revenue could be more intoxicating than harvesting olives. The coinage swelled with captured silver. Temples in Rome acquired African and Spanish spoils. Triumphal processions educated citizens in distant geography. Slaves arrived in numbers that changed labor markets. Veterans sought plots and found politics. Above all, the Roman calendar discovered new seasons, campaigning in Spain this year, in Liguria next, then Macedonia, then Asia. War not as emergency but as routine. Rome began the Punic century a city that could say no to kings. It ended it a state that could appoint client kings. In Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, and Africa, the Republic learned to tax, to garrison, to judge with interpreters, to negotiate with peoples whose gods did not speak Latin. The Senate's minutes thickened, magistrates' edicts lengthened, roads snaked to ports and ports to promontories. Hannibal had given Rome its deepest scar and perversely its best education, how to survive a genius and become an empire. When the smoke over Carthage thinned, your map did not go quiet. It tilted east, where successor kings of Alexander, Macedon's Antigonids, Syria's Seleucids, Egypt's Ptolemies, and leagues of cities kept politics in the key of theater. If Rome had learned from Carthage how to be maritime, it would learn from Greece how to be an arbiter, how to speak in decrees, trophies, and friendship, and how to leave garrisons that swore they were only visiting. The first caller was Philip V of Macedon, young, clever, and unlucky to live in a world that had just invented Roman interest. The First Macedonian War, 215 to 205 BC, ran alongside Hannibal's invasion, more shadowbox than slugfest. Rome allied with the Aetolian League in Rhodes, skirmished in Illyria, and learned the names of islands that later would matter for grain and prestige. The Peace of Phoenix was polite and temporary. What remained was Rome's new habit of keeping one eye on the Adriatic's far shore. It was the Second Macedonian War, 200 to 196 BC, that pulled Rome fully onto the Hellenic stage. Philip's pressure on Greek cities gave Roman diplomats a moral they never tired of rehearsing. "We come to free the Greeks." Titus Quinctius Flamininus, a consul with Greek on his tongue and an ear for applause, defeated Philip at Cynocephaly, 197 BC. Dogs' heads. Hills whose folds let maniples do what they did best, flex and tear at a phalanx when ground and timing betrayed the long pikes. The following year at the Isthmian Games, Flamininus stood before a stadium of cities and proclaimed freedom for Hellas. The shout that answered, Livy swears birds fell from the sky, became the soundbite Rome loved to play. Garrisons were withdrawn from some strongholds, chains were struck from some cities. And yet the fetters of Greece, Chalcis, Demetrius, and the Acrocorinth remained strategic nouns Rome could revisit whenever freedom required supervision. Mainstream fact, as crisp as an inscribed steel, Philip V kept his throne but lost his Greek ambitions and paid indemnities. Macedon's phalanx, still fearsome on the flat, could be unstitched by Roman maniples on broken ground. Flamininus' settlement restored several cities and leagues and removed Macedonian garrisons. In 194 BC the Romans sailed away, to cheering and to ledgers of influence that did not need marines to be real. Greek cities began receiving senatus consulta in Greek, posted on temple walls. Rome spoke through bronze and marble as easily as through steel. And no sooner had the applause faded than the Eastern script introduced a taller actor, Antiochus III the Great of the Seleucid Empire. Courted by the Aetolians, liberty had many agents. Antiochus crossed to Greece. Hannibal, an exile with advice, reputedly murmured strategy at his court. Rome answered with alliances, Pergamum and Rhodes, with Scipio brothers for theater, Publius negotiating, Lucius commanding, and with another demonstration of logistics. Thermopylae, 191 BC, sent Antiochus back to Asia. Magnesia, 190 BC, made it law. Elephants panicked. Roman lines held. Pergamene cavalry rolled the flank. A Hellenistic king sued for terms. The Treaty of Apamea, 188 BC, reads like an instruction manual for making an Eastern superpower polite. Vast indemnity, ship limits, no elephants, withdrawals from Anatolia west of the Taurus, hostages to Rome, including, in time, princes whose childhoods would smell of the Tiber. One of them, Demetrius, later Soter, would learn Latin in Italy and go home to a throne with Roman fingerprints. Another, Antiochus IV, had already spent boyhood years as a hostage and returned to turn piety into spectacle at Jerusalem and Antioch with a showman's flair. Rome rewarded allies, Pergamum fattened into a regional broker, Rhodes received islands and prestige, until, years later, a Roman free port at Delos undercut Rhodes' customs revenue, proof that friendship is also a budget. The Greeks themselves were not stage props. The Achaean and Aetolian leagues, federal experiments with assemblies and magistrates, negotiated, sulked, rearmed, and petitioned, issuing decrees that thanked Roman generals as saviors, even while filing complaints about garrisons and fines. Rome learned the Hellenistic etiquette of crowns and statues, of proxeny decrees that named Roman commanders as friends and benefactors, and of embassies that treated the Senate as a second Delphi. In return, senators learned to listen to Greek envoys who could turn a proem into a policy. Polybius, an Achaean statesman later deported to Italy as a hostage, learned to watch Romans up close and wrote the book, literally, on how they stitched timetables into empire. Quirky tidbit: at the Isthmian proclamation, Flamininus' Greek was good enough to draw cheers, and his coin issues in Greece carried legends locals could read. Another, the Senate's decrees to Greek cities were sometimes copied onto the city's walls in impeccable Greek but with Latin legal habits peeking through. Friends and allies of the Roman people became almost a brand, their ellipses filled by fines, frontier adjustments, and polite commands. Macedon tried one more time to make the old shape fit. Perseus, Philip's son, reorganized finances, courted city elites, and frightened Rome the way fiscal prudence often does. The Third Macedonian War, 171 to 168 BC, ended at Pydna, where a late afternoon clash on rough ground broke the phalanx's unity. The image Romans cherished, short swords slipping into gaps between long pikes, cavalry routing cavalry, a king fleeing, was as much morale as mechanics, but the verdict was unambiguous. Macedon's monarchy was abolished. The kingdom split into 4 Marides, regions, forbidden to intermarry or mine together. Tribute ran west. Later, after the pretender Andriscus briefly revived royal dreams, Rome made Macedon a province. 148 BC, the experiment with indirect control had found its limit. Repercussions rolled south. In 146 BC, the same year Carthage died in Africa, Corinth fell in Greece. The Achaean League, pushed into a corner by missteps and Roman impatience, fought and lost. Lucius Mummius sacked the city with a thoroughness that even Romans winced at. He warned contractors carrying statues to Italy that if they damaged them they must replace them, an attempt at quality control that survives as comedy, because Greek originals do not grow on trees. The Senate dissolved the League. Freedom, narrowed to municipal obedience under a Roman governor in Macedonia whose letters now cross 2 mountain ranges. Mainstream fact again. 200 to 146 BC saw 3 Macedonian wars. Cynocephaly broke Philip. Pydna broke the monarchy. Greece was free in 196, supervised by admonitions and arbitration, and partially annexed in 146. Apamea crippled Seleucid reach. Rhodes and Pergamum rose, then found Roman favor fickle. In 133 BC, Attalus III of Pergamum died childless and willed his kingdom to Rome. After a brief revolt, Aristonicus, freedom, under the name Eumenes III, the bequest became the province of Asia. Rome, which once refused kings, now inherited them by will. What changed inside Rome as it learned Eastern diplomacy? First, the Senate's inbox grew, and with it a habit of arbitration. Quarrels over borders, debts to temples, and rivalries between gymnasium factions arrived as embassies, were debated in Latin, and answered in Greek. Senatus Consulta began to look like circuit court verdicts. Second, money and marble flowed. Spoils and indemnities underwrote roads, games, and the political careers of men who could now promise more panthers. Greek art colonized Roman houses. Greek tutors colonized Roman sons. The Scipionic circle in Rome, Scipio Aemilianus, Laelius, Polybius, Terence, talked about constitutions over dinner and invented nostalgia for moderation even as their triumphs paid the bill. Third, the army's calendar stopped ending. Provinces meant permanent commands, commands meant patrons, patrons meant clients and expectations. Governors learned the Hellenistic language of benefaction, building stoas, endowing festivals, forgiving taxes, acts that made them statues abroad and votes at home. They also learned, some too well, how to turn provinces into cash machines. Courts in Rome, the Quaestio de Reputandis, tried to police extortion. Juries, packed with equites after reforms, discovered that judging one's own class is a subtle sport. Historians still argue the big questions. Did Rome intend empire in the East or stumble into it one arbitration at a time? Was freedom of the Greeks cynical propaganda or a genuine policy briefly possible before entanglements multiplied? Was the legion's superiority to the phalanx structural or situational, terrain and leadership more decisive than kit? Did Pydna prove anything that Cynocephaly had not, or did it only confirm that hills hate Cerissus? And how much did Greek culture conquer Rome in return? Was the Senate a Roman body with Greek taste, or a Greek mind wearing Latin togas? Quirky tidbit 2, Rhodes once sent Rome a giant sundial. Romans installed it in the Forum, watched its shadow, and then complained that their hours were now too short. Proof that technology always has a politics. Another, When Rome punished Rhodes after Pydna by declaring Delos a free port, under Athenian management, customs men in the Aegean learned faster than philosophers how a single senatorial sentence can shift the balance sheets of islands. The net result by the mid-2nd century BC was a Mediterranean with Rome at the center of a web. Some strands were provinces with governors and taxes: Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, Hispania, Macedonia, Asia. Others were friends and allies, who wrote long decrees of gratitude while watching their autonomy shrink by correspondence. Ambassadors came to Rome with crowns and complaints. Kings styled themselves brother and friend of the Roman people. City-states voted votive statues to men they hoped would remember their names in Latin. The Republic had learned to arbitrate like a king, to collect like a merchant, and to write in a Greek that said, with perfect politeness, "Do this." At home, the consequences were beginning to ferment. Wealth pooling in few hands, farms shifting from citizens' smallholdings to estates worked by slaves bought with eastern windfalls, political careers balancing on the fulcrum of foreign commands. Those are the pressures that will carry us, inexorably, toward reforms, proscriptions, and men whose calendars refuse to end. But for now, in the 2nd century, the Senate can still pretend that it withdraws when it wishes and returns only at invitation. Generals can still claim they free cities by occupying their citadels less obtrusively than Macedon ever did. You could say Rome inherited the East. More precisely, it learned to inherit, by treaty, by will, by arbitration, by applause. Macedon and Greece submitted, but not in silence. Their institutions, art, and rhetoric colonized Roman minds even as Roman legions colonized their hills. The Republic stepped off the Isthmian stage to cheers, then returned through the side door with a letter in Greek that every city learned to read aloud. Empire is not just a larger map, it's a longer spreadsheet. When Rome stepped beyond Italy, victory stopped being a verb shouted on a field and became a set of nouns: provincia, stipendium, vectigalia, vai publici, that needed clerks as badly as they needed legions. A provincia in the Republic began as an assignment, a task. Spain this year, Sicily's grain, Macedonia's settlement. Over time the word hardened into geography and calendar both, spaces attached to magistrates with dates, duties, and judges who traveled with the law in their baggage. The miracle, and sometimes the scandal, of the Roman system is that it turned campaign seasons into administrations and tribute into habit. Start with the governor, that improvisation made flesh. He is typically an ex-consul or ex-praetor whose imperium has been prolonged, prorogatio, until the Senate finds a successor. He arrives with lictors fewer than in Rome, bundo rods minus theater, a staff of legates and friends, and a quaestor whose job is to watch the money and, ideally, the governor's soul. He carries edicts, rules of the provincial road, interest limits, market days, court calendars, tax collection methods, posted in Latin and, when kindness outruns pride, in Greek or Punic. He judges cases at assize circuits, conventus, hears disputes between city and city, citizen and ally, merchant and magistrate, temple and tax farmer. His tent is a courtroom, his chair a reminder that for a year, or two, or three when the calendar misbehaves, he is the Republic's vocabulary in that place. Sicily became the first workshop. After the First Punic War, Rome learned that an island of grain requires rules, tithe systems, decimi, farmed out by auction, storage schedules, delivery quotas, and harbor fees. The urban center of Syracuse kept prestige. Roman praetors and later propraetors kept accounts. Sardinia and Corsica followed with salt, timber, and nerves. In Spain, Hispania's superior and ulterior, governors discovered that conquest can be a verb that never finishes. Tribes pacified in summer sprout grievances by spring. In Macedonia and later Asia, the problems wore togas. Cities with councils and pride asked for arbitration, not orders. and judges had to perform law rather than simply pronounce it. Mainstream fact, arranged like a docket. By the mid-2nd century BC, Rome administered a growing set of provinces: Sicily, 241, Sardinia Corsica, 238, Hispania Superior and Ulterior, 197, Macedonia, 148, Africa, 146, Asia, after Attalus' bequest, formally 129. Governors were assigned annually by senatorial decree, often after a sortition, drawing lots, among eligible ex-magistrates. Imperium was extended outside the pomerium and constrained, in theory, by law and by the possibility of prosecution on return, repetandi trials for extortion. Taxes included land tithes, portoria, customs, and in some regions, a poll or pasture dues. Collection was often contracted to equestrian companies, the publicani, who bid for the right to harvest revenue and then harvested with vigor. Roads were military in origin but commercial in effect. The Via Aemilia cutting across Cisalpine Gaul, the Via Domitia creeping into Transalpine country, causeways in Africa turning spring mud into scheduled if you wish to run an empire cheaply, outsource. Rome did, enthusiastically. The publicani bid in Rome for tax contracts, paying a lump sum up front for the privilege, and then extracting their investment plus profit from provincials under the governor's theoretically watchful eyes. In Asia, the richest province, this meant cities facing equestrian syndicates with sharp pencils and sharper lawyers. Governors could tame abuses or collude in them, hence the quaestio de repetundis, the standing court in Rome where plundered provincials, or their allies, might bring cases against former magistrates. Cicero's prosecution of Verres, a Sicilian governor whose catalogue of theft reads like a darkly comic museum tour, is the most famous sermon on provincial justice. Statues stolen, grain squeezed, courts rigged, roads neglected. Sicily spoke Latin in court and the Senate pretended to blush. Quirky tidbit. Those publicani were the hedge fund managers of their day, and like all financiers they traveled with a mascot, an abacus. In auction halls on the Capitoline they clacked beads and shouted bids under the gaze of Saturn's temple, a reminder that in Rome even gods are auditors. Another, governors sometimes issued bronze tokens, tesserae, to regulate queues at assizes. Think ancient take-a-number slips with the whiff of theater. Roads made everything louder. A Roman via is an argument in stone, cambered surface, drainage ditches, milestones that tell you exactly how far you are from where Rome insists is the center. Governors repaired, extended, and bragged. Inscriptions along the Via Aemilia named the magistrates who laid or mended this stretch, a curriculum vitae in limestone. In Africa, straight causeways stitched farm to forum. In Spain, roads crawled along river valleys like patience. In Asia, existing Hellenistic routes were rebadged and regularized. Cursus publicus, the later imperial posting system, is not yet formal, but couriers run and requisitions, and Gary, exist. Local communities obliged to supply carts and beasts for official travel. Abuse, always a close cousin, was curbed by edict where governors feared poets, ignored where they did not. Cities did the heavy lifting. Rome did not re-engineer civic life, it tapped it. Each province contained a patchwork, colony of Roman or Latin settlers wearing miniature republics, municipia with partial rights, allied cities with treaties, foederati, and free cities, liberi, who paid in compliments if not in cash. Councils, curiae bull, collected taxes, fielded levies, maintained roads, hosted courts, and sent embassies to Rome when insulted by neighbors or by rapacious staff. Temples, treasuries, and gymnasia kept money, piety, and politics braided together. Governors sat in theater porticos to pronounce judgment because theater was where cities did their best listening. Historians still argue the great accounting question, Did provinces impoverish their subjects or enrich them by stabilizing trade lanes, standardizing coinage, and enforcing contracts? In some districts, Spain's mines, Asia's merchant cities, wealth demonstrably pooled. In others, the publicani's appetite eroded small farmers into debt and estates. Was Rome a predator with law books or a broker with legions? The ledger is mixed. Archaeology shows paved fora, new aqueducts, and stamped amphorae shipping wine and oil farther and faster. It also shows abandoned hill farms and mass graves when pacification went badly. Polybius praises Rome's regular courts. Sallust snarls about greed. The truth wears both their faces. Light joke 1. A governor bragged that under his edict even the mules smiled. A muleteer replied that smiles increase with lighter loads and lower tolls. Light joke 2. A publicanus claimed the gods loved him because he kept the temples busy with thanks. A priest countered that the gods were too polite to say what they felt. Light joke 3. A road surveyor vowed that his roads were so straight because he always walked home in a straight line from the tavern. A censor fined the tavern. The calendar stretched. In Italy, a consul's year felt like a season. Abroad, prorogation made time elastic. A successful commander in Spain might hold his province for several years because the Senate feared replacement would reset rapport. A mediocre one lingered because politics at home jammed the appointment machinery. Distance loosened accountability. Letters took weeks. Reports could be curated. Hence the Roman trick of sending not just the governor but his rival's friend as legate. Hence the habit of provinces sending embassies to the Senate midterm to complain. Hence the importance of triumph. Only a return in glory could launder a long absence into virtue. Law traveled in suitcases. Governors issued a dicta provincial that borrowed from the Praetorian handbook and local custom. Interest caps, typically 12% annually, kept Roman lenders from turning debt into empire within the empire. Sureties were named. Harvest failure clauses penned. Market regulations posted. The aediles Roman edicts on fraud at markets found Greek and Punic equivalents. Weights and measures inspected. Bad grain fined. Theatrical producers warned that panther shortage is not force majeure. In mixed disputes, Roman versus non-Roman, governors often appointed recuperators, jury-like panels, to sift fact from eloquence. Quirky tidbit 2. Court days in Asia could look like festivals. Vendors in the shade, plaintiffs rehearsing with hired readers, scribes selling copies of the governor's edict so you could quote chapter and section to his face. In Spain, litigants sometimes brought a jar of local wine as diplomacy. Smart governors sent it to their staff to taste first. For poison, yes, but also for politics. Praise a vintage and you own a valley. Tribute, stipendium, and tax, vectigal, are different animals. Stipendium is war's aftertaste, a fixed levy imposed on a conquered people. Vectigalia are the ongoing dues of the Roman fiscal state, harbor fees, pasture dues, mine rents, and the agricultural tithe in places like Sicily. Sicily's tithe, regulated by the Lex Hieronica, named for Hiero II's earlier system, became a model. Predictable percentages, auctions to middlemen, penalties for failure to deliver, and appeal to the governor when abuse outpaced patience. Regularity is the gift Rome boasts of giving. Predictability is the gift provincials hope to receive. Mainstream aside, in the tone of an inscription, the Senate assigns provinces annually. Sortitio determines who goes where. Prorogatio extends commands. Quaestors handle funds. Publicani collect taxes under contract. Governors publish edicts, sit in assizes, and carry fasces outside Italy. Extortion courts in Rome judge misdeeds. Rhodes, Emilia, Domitia, Papilia, and more bind cities, coinage. Flows, denarii stamped with Roma's helmeted head paying soldiers and suppliers. This is the empire's operating system before emperors, senatorial committees, equestrian contractors, municipal councils, and magistrates who carry both sword and stylus. The human side persists. Governors host diplomatic dinners where seating charts are foreign policy. They tour temples and compliment gods in the correct dialect. They free a slave in a city square to show Roman justice is portable. They attend local games and pretend not to notice when a poet recites lines praising their clemency while actually praising the donor of the theater seats. They also lose tempers, fall in love with villas, and borrow money at bad rates from the very companies they are supposed to supervise. On their best days they are in partial habit, on their worst, local storms with Latin captions. Historians still argue a more uncomfortable question. Did the Republic have a theory of empire or just a habit of issuing notices? Some see policy, moderation in Sicily, indirect rule in Asia, brutal clarity in Africa when patience failed. Others see accretion, ad hoc fixes that became precedent that became ideology only when Cicero needed to define province in a speech. The debate about exploitation versus integration has found allies in amphora stamps and in court speeches. Either side will retire. Perhaps the most Roman answer is, it worked until it didn't, and then we wrote a new edict. If roads, taxes, and governors sound dry, listen for their music. A road is a promise that troops and lawsuits will arrive. A tax is a schedule that outlives a consul's pride. A governor is a voice that teaches the Republic's grammar to cities that already speak policy. When Augustus later recuts the machine and nails time to long tenures, he will inherit this infrastructure: provincial charters, boundary stones, courts and porticos, and accountants who know how many mules it takes to carry a year's arrears from a Phrygian valley to the quay at Ephesus. Light joke 3 to close the ledger. A provincial once asked the governor when Rome would stop sending roads. "When you stop sending lawsuits," he replied. The town applauded, then immediately petitioned for a new bridge, because empire is a conversation where both sides learn to enjoy their lines. By the late 2nd century, tribute had settled into rhythm, ships with grain from Sicily and Africa timing themselves to Rome's hunger, silver from Spain buying more ships, customs from Asia underwriting marble in the Forum, and roads laying down the drumbeat under it all. The Republic had turned conquest into paperwork and paperwork into power. The map still grew, but the miracle was that the margins of the ledger kept up. Before soldiers marched for emperors, they learned to march for paymasters. The late 2nd century BC strained Rome's old militia model. Citizen farmers levied for a season, returning to vines and lawsuits when the campaign calendar closed. Spain's long wars did not respect harvests. Jugurtha in Numidia fought like a rumor you could never quite catch. Northern tribes, Cimbri and Teutons, fell on Italy with weather and audacity. The Republic's levy, calibrated for tidy Italian summers, found itself asked to be a year-round habit. Into that pressure walked Gaius Marius, a new man, from Arpinum with a jaw like a plowshare and a political talent for promising competence. Marius made his name in the Jugurthine War, 112 to 105 BC, nominally under Metellus but very much as a rival waiting for the Senate to notice him. When he won the consulship in 107, he asked for Numidia and got it by popular vote, already a sign that command and assembly might begin to court each other directly. In Africa he recruited not only the traditional property-owning classes but also the Capitency, the head count of the census rolls, men too poor to qualify under the old levy. The Senate clucked about precedent. Marius counted bodies and put spears in their hands. For men with no farms to hurry home to, the army became employment, advancement, and identity. The state, or the general acting as the state, provided equipment. Booty and donatives sweetened loyalty. Veterans would later expect land. A temporary expedient proved contagious. Organization shifted too, less invention than consolidation, but notable. The legion's maniples had already learned flexibility in Italy's hills. Marius is credited, perhaps too generously, with standardizing the cohort as the primary tactical unit. 6 centuries grouped together, 10 cohorts to a legion for a neat paper strength around 4,800 men. Where maniples danced, cohorts marched solid, emphasizing depth and mutual support. Commanders found it easier to delegate to fewer, larger blocks. Logistics like the round numbers, scribes purred. He is also tied to the universal adoption of the eagle, Aquila, as the legion's sole standard, a totem that turned units into almost religious communities around an altar of feathers and silver. Mainstream fact, arranged like a parade, Marius held the consulship an unprecedented 7 times, 107, 104 to 186, defeated the Teutons at Aquae Sexti, 102, and the Cimbri at Vercelli, 101, and ended the Jugurthine War with a combination of pressure and the useful betrayal engineered by his quaestor Sulla. Recruitment rules loosened, poor citizens entered ranks in greater numbers, the state furnished arms more systematically, cohort structure gained primacy. The pilum, heavy javelin, adopted a soft iron or cleverly pinned shank so it bent on impact and could not be thrown back. The aquilifer, eagle-bearer, acquired a mystique that would outlive republics. Veterans came to expect land allotments upon discharge, tying soldier futures to the political fortunes of their commanders. Pay and pack changed the silhouette of a legionary. The Marius meals trope, men carrying their own kit on forked poles, Fursi, speaks to a drive for autonomy and speed. Where trained animals bogged, men trudged. Where wagons shrieked at mud, centuries smiled grimly and kept going. Camp discipline, already a Roman pride, became a daily sacrament. Marching camps thrown up with spade and sweat at day's end, trenches and ramparts chalked onto landscapes like graph paper, streets laid out by habits so a legion sleeping could find its cookpot in the dark. The army became less a convened crowd and more an institution that traveled, courts, temples, market, workshops, folded into itself. Quirky tidbit, one version of the pilum reform fastened the iron shank to the wooden haft with a single wooden peg that shattered on impact, making the javelin droop like a disappointed opinion when it bit a shield. Another tells of soft iron below a hard tip. Either way, the goal was the same. Your enemy holds a heavy, bent thing instead of a weapon. Also, legionaries named their shovels. It is not in the sources, but it must be true. People who dig nightly give names. With professional soldiers came professional expectations. Service length stretched. 6 years in theory for Allied infantry, 16 and more in practice as pragmatism gnawed at statutes. Stipendium pay mattered, so did donativa, cash gifts, from commanders after victories. Soldiers began to look not merely to the residential publica for reward but to the general who had led them into danger and could lead them into land. When Marius settled veterans on Italian plots after the Cimbric Wars, he set a political precedent, a commander as patron for thousands of armed clients. It made electoral sense. It also rewired loyalties. Historians still argue how Marian, the Marian reforms truly were. Some see a single architect, others see a long slope, property qualifications eroding already under the strain of Spanish wars, the cohort ascending gradually, the Aquila's primacy a later codification, not an edict. The poor had served before in emergencies, the state had issued gear where needed, cohortal tactics appear in earlier campaigns. Marius, in this telling, is a famous label on a bottle filled by many hands. Yet even the skeptics concede that his repeated consulships, his recruitment policy, and his spectacular northern victories gave coherence and prestige to changes that might otherwise have lingered as local experiments. If armies became careers, then generals became employers. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, quaestor under Marius in Numidia, learned that bargain up close. When a Mithridatic command later slipped from his fingers in Rome's churn, Sulla marched his legions on the city, 88 BC, a sacrilege that became rehearsal for worse. His soldiers followed because loyalty now ran down the chain of pay and promise as much as up the ladder of law. Proscriptions, lists of the condemned, funded retirements, and land for more veterans, which in turn produced more men who remembered a patron's name before they remembered Senate and Roman people. Client armies had been born. Light joke 1. A wit claimed Rome solved unemployment with two policies: bigger armies and bigger amphitheaters. A moralist replied that only one of those institutions taught men to fill ditches properly. Light joke 2. When a recruit asked how long he'd serve, the centurion said, "Until you stop polishing your helmet with your reflection," which is military for a while. Light joke 3. About the Aquila. A soldier bragged that their eagle could scare real ones. A farmer said, "Feed mine and it will scare yours." The consequences reached the forum. Land bills to settle veterans, beneficial and destabilizing, became campaign planks. Tribunes like Saturninus attached grain and colonization schemes to Marius' prestige, discovering that legislating with a general's shadow behind you was exhilarating until it was fatal. The Senate tried to reassert calendar control. Populace learned to bypass it with the people's vote when a commander's fame primed the crowd. Armies that stayed together for years under the same legatus and centurions developed corporate identities. Officers groomed by one patron moved with him from province to province, a portable network of obedience and favors. Training changed tone. Polybius had admired Roman drills a century earlier. Now drill masters turned rigor into habit sharper still. Javelin practice, sword thrusts, Romans preferred stab to slash, efficient and less romantic. Shield work, ditch digging, route marching, each became both exercise and indoctrination. Veterans taught recruits in the classic sergeant-major mode, sarcasm soaked in affection. Punishments, fines, extra rations of grain to grind, fustrarium, club beating, in extreme cases, policed a new social body that would spend winters together, not just summers, inventing folklore and nicknames. The legion ceased to be a convened militia and became a profession with a culture. Mainstream aside, precise as a camp gate, Marius' African and Northern campaigns, 107 to 101, coincided with recruitment of lower property classes. Cohort organization and the Aquila's emblematic singularity emerge in this window. Pack carrying, Marius mules, becomes proverbial. The pilum likely modified to prevent reuse. Discharge benefits, land, occasionally cash, became expectations to be met by legislation, often controversial, in the assemblies. Service terms lengthened and standardized only later under Augustus, 20+ years. But the drift toward long service begins here. Sulla's march on Rome, 88, and later civil wars, 40s, demonstrate the political effect. Legions loyal to commanders' purse and promises, willing to arbitrate Roman law by encampment. The state tried to keep up. Laws against military bribery existed, and courts could, in theory, punish governors who promised illegal pledges. In practice, the line between a lawful donativum and a corrupt stipendium was smoke. The Senate could assign provinces cautiously to keep any one man from hoarding too many legions. Clever men arranged for emergencies that defeated caution. Italian citizenship extended after the Social War, 90s BC, gave a broader recruiting base. Good for manpower, complicated for politics. Men from all Italy now bled under standards and then returned to towns that wanted roads, courts, and protection in return. Quirky tidbit 2. The legion's eagle traveled with a small shrine. Before battle, sacrifices and vows concentrated courage in a handful of rites. A bull here, a libation there, a promise of games if the gods minded their duty. Eagles lost in battle were catastrophes that poets could dine on for a decade. Recovery of an eagle, like those later from Parthia, was a diplomatic triumph equal to a battlefield win in Roman hearts. Pay math mattered. A legionary's stipend, traditionally 120 denarii a year before Caesar raised it, vanished under deductions, rations, boots, the tent you tore, the meal you irritated. Booty made the difference, and booty followed generalship, Spain's mines, Pontic treasuries, Gaul's plunder. Soldiers learned to hear the music of coin under speeches. They cheered reforms that kept their bellies and their future green. The Republic's paradox sharpened. To win wars you needed soldiers loyal to a person. To keep a republic you needed soldiers loyal to an abstraction. The abstraction had fallen behind on its wages. Historians still argue one more delicate point. Did professionalization improve tactical performance, or merely change logistics and politics? Legions under Marius and Sulla performed superbly. So had legions under earlier consuls. Cohorts simplified command, but genius still mattered at the hinge of a line. What seems least debatable is the social effect. The army became a career for the poor and ambitious, a ladder whose top was a farm plot and perhaps citizenship for a son if you began as an allied recruit. In that sense, the legions became a Romanization engine with drums, Latin orders, standardized kit, shared oaths, and retirement colonies that planted Roman cults and crops together. As the 1st century BC tilted towards civil war, the Marian army, portable, professional, personal, proved both Rome's sword and its constitutional pry bar. Pompey would build his reputation with private armies sanctioned by extraordinary commands. Caesar would cross a small river with men whose pay he had kept honest, and whose futures he had promised. The Senate, stout in counsel and thin in soldiers of its own, discovered that eloquence loses arguments with cohorts. And yet, the soldiers' virtues did not sour. The camp still taught thrift, courage, humor, and the joy of a trench finished before rain. Centurions still carried vine staves and pride in equal weights. Eagles still glittered over helmets dented by bad aim and good luck. A professional army was not merely a problem. It was also a craft that thousands of nameless men learned well enough to make an empire possible and, for a while, governable. In short, Marius didn't invent the professional army from nothing, but he arranged the parts, labeled the boxes, and taught Rome to prefer a ledger that could be balanced with coin rather than hope. The Republic paid the bill later, in marches on Rome and in calendars replaced by careers. But in the decade when tribes threatened and Jugurtha smirked, the reforms steadied a polity that needed steadiness. The legions would never again be seasonal verbs. They had become nouns, with paybooks. If the Republic is a stage managed by procedure, the first man to drag scenery by the edge of his sword is Lucius Cornelius Sulla. The door he forces open, marching a Roman army into Rome, had hinges, technically, but they were for processions and triumphs, not for legions with opinions. In 88 BC, the Senate had assigned Sulla the command against Mithridates VI of Pontus, a king who had tested Asia's patience and then murdered tens of thousands of Romans and Italian allies in the Asian Vespers. Gaius Marius, old, famous, and not yet ready to narrate from a rocking chair, wanted that command back. A tribune, Publius Sulpicius Rufus, proposed a law transferring it to Marius. Street fighting attended the vote. Sulla, outside Rome mustering his men, received news that the constitution had been amended at knife point. Sulla answered with an innovation that terrified precedent. He turned his legions around and walked them into the city. Lictors were not supposed to share the street with standards. The Pomerium, Rome's sacred boundary, could be crossed by imperium only with polite fictions. Sulla dispensed with fictions. On the cobbles, soldiers loyal to a commander's promise met citizens loyal to a calendar. The soldiers won. Sulpicius was killed. Marius fled, legend has it, hiding in marshes and on the coast, a figure reduced from 7-time consul to a fugitive who still believed his wrists remembered rope better than retirement. Sulla did not keep Italy waiting. He used the assemblies to sacralize his coup, criminals declared, laws passed to strengthen the Senate's control of courts and to weaken the tribunate's power to legislate without senatorial blessing. Then, because Mithridates was still rewriting Asia's maps, Sulla left. He marched east to fight the foreign war while the city he had traumatized worked out whether it was still a republic or a memory with committees. The vacuum filled. Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a consul who discovered his inner radical, allied with Marius. Rome, unpracticed at coups and now an eager student, learned a second lesson in civil blood. In 87 BC, Cinna and the returning Marius fought their way into the city. The Senate capitulated. Reprisals followed. Marius, elected to his 7th consulship for 86, died soon after, exhausted, triumphant, dangerous to remember. Cinna kept Italy under Marian control for several years, raising troops, reassigning lands, and proving that Rome now had 2 calendars, the printed one and the one generals brought back from their provinces. Sulla, meanwhile, campaigned in Greece and Asia with the competence of a man who compartmentalizes. He took Athens in 86 after a grim siege. At Chaeronea and Orchomenus he crushed Mithridates' generals, fighting phalanxes with cohorts on ground Rome had already learned to love. The settlement, Peace of Dardanus, 85 BC, punished and pardoned with Roman arithmetic, indemnities, fleet reductions, hostages, and a restoration of boundaries. Asia groaned under fines. Sulla collected enough to pay his soldiers, to bankroll a return, and to buy a future where gratitude and terror could be mistaken for law. Return he did. In 83 BC he landed in southern Italy, greeted not by indictments but by recruits, young Pompey, gathering 3 legions from Picenum with the energy of a talented volunteer. Marcus Licinius Crassus, money in his wake, old connections who understood which way weather now blew. The Marians sighed, Cinna dead, his army mutinied. Gnaeus Carbo and the younger Marius in charge faced Sulla's coalition with courage and bad luck. Battles and sieges punctuated a campaign that was also a political negotiation written with swords. At the Colline Gate, 82 BC, just outside Rome's walls, Sulla's right nearly broke under a Samnite onslaught. Old social war grudges still sharpened, until Crassus' left turned victory at the hinge. The city awoke to the nearest thing to a sack a Roman army could perform without calling it that. Then came the innovation that gave a new noun to Latin cruelty: proscriptions. Lists were posted, names of men declared enemies of the state. To kill a proscribed man was to earn a reward. To shelter him was to court your own listing. To buy his confiscated property at auction was to launder theft into policy. This was not casual lynching, it was paperwork weaponized. Heads appeared on the rostra. Property transferred to the treasury or to friends. Sons and grandsons of the proscribed were barred from office, a hereditary time bomb. Numbers survive in disagreeing hands. Ancient writers count hundreds of senators and equestrians, thousands overall. Modern caution frowns at arithmetic and anecdotes. But the effect is not numerical, it is constitutional. Violence had become an office. Mainstream fact: as neat as a decree carved in oak, Sulla took the title Dictator Re Publici Constituendi. Dictator for the reconstitution of the Republic. A revival of an old magistracy in new clothes, without the classical 6-month limit, empowered to legislate. He enlarged the Senate to about 600, filled it with his supporters, and restructured courts, the questions perpetui, to be judged by senators rather than equites. He humbled the tribunate. Tribunes could no longer propose laws to the people without prior senatorial approval, and a man who had been tribune was barred from further high office, turning the popular safeguard into a cul-de-sac. He regularized provincial commands and tried to pin careers back to the cursus honorum with ages and intervals. Municipal charters were revised, priesthood colleges elasticized, and veterans were settled in colonies across Italy, 23 or more, by one count, staking Sulla's memory into soil with allotments and resentment. Quirky tidbit: proscriptions came with signage. Auction boards, tabulae proscriptionis, listed confiscated estates, inviting buyers with a mixture of bargain and guilt. A joke of the day had a man studying the notice board for property and being asked whether he was hunting villas or enemies. "Which is cheaper?" he replied. Another grim flourish: a sullen partisan supposedly nailed a proscribed enemy's head to his own dining room door. To save time, a detail the sources preserve with the kind of theatrical specificity that smells like moral instruction. Did the reforms restore the Republic? Historians still argue. Admirers, few, but literate, say Sulla reasserted senatorial primacy, disciplined tribunician mischief, and gave courts a stable home. Critics, more numerous, sometimes survivors, say he murdered politics in order to save it, making fear do the work of consensus. The tribunate's hobbling lasted barely a decade. Popular pressure and ambitious conservatives, ironies abound, restored much of its vigor in the 70s. The senatorial juries, intended to check equestrian predation in the provinces, revealed that senators could be as inventive in theft as tax farmers. Sulla's calendar, careers regimented, commands limited, looked wise on a wall and soft under a general. The human toll had a geography. Praeneste, where Marius the Younger holed up before surrender, saw executions that echoed through Italian memory. Norba fell. Samnite towns paid in men and walls. Sertorius, a Marian with genius for persuasion, escaped to Spain and built a counter-republic that would vex Sulla's heirs for a decade. Pompey, who helped butcher the remnants in Sicily and Africa, returned to demand a triumph despite not yet having held curule office. The Senate harumphed. Sulla, practical, yielded. Crassus used the auctions to buy the future. His fortune grew hands that would later rub against Pompey's in awkward handshake. Light joke 1. A wag observed that Sulla had restored liberty so thoroughly that nobody dared use it. Light joke 2. When told the tribunate was now safe, a citizen asked whether safety meant it came with a lock or a leash. Light joke 3. Pompey's young soldiers, drunk on victory and bad wine, toasted Felix, Sulla's self-chosen cognomen, the Lucky, and declared themselves Felix too. The innkeeper asked whether luck came with coin. They discovered it did not. Sulla retired, a detail that still startles. In 79 BC, having enacted his program and held a normal consulship, 80, as a kind of constitutional bow, he resigned the dictatorship, dismissed his lictors, and decamped to his villa at Puteoli to write memoirs in a style later critics called unsleeping vanity. He died the next year, intestines notoriously ungrateful, and was buried with honors. His epitaph, reported by Plutarch, bragged that no friend benefited more and no enemy was harmed less than Sulla found appropriate. The men he had empowered, Pompey, Crassus, and in their separate corners, Cicero and Catullus, would test how long fear can sit in chairs designed for consent. Debate reaches for counterfactuals. If Sulla had stayed east, would Cinna's regime have matured into reforms without rivers of blood? If Sulla's senatorial courts had proved less predatory, would equestrian tax syndicates have been checked without the pendulum swinging toward popular revenge? Was the first march on Rome a point of no return, or could another generation have redomesticated legions to provinces and kept them from reading the Forum as battlefield? Scholars argue causation like jurists. The social war's militarization, Marius' professional soldiers, Mithridates' catastrophe, Italy's new citizens, each a loaded die thrown onto a table already nicked by ambition. Quirky tidbit 2, Sulla's, Felix, brand extended to a signet ring depicting his divine favorite, Venus. He liked to dedicate spoils to her and to Fortuna, hedging even his luck. A superstitious anecdote has him seeing a goddess in a dream who handed him lightning. Critics replied that he preferred handing it out in daylight. What did Rome learn? That law without force can be mocked, and that force without law teaches bad habits quickly. That auctions can normalize theft if stamped with eagles. That exile is a school for future trouble, Sertorius, later Caesar's partisans. That settlement of veterans makes for grateful colonists, and sullen dispossessed. That the tribunate, once hobbled, returns with sharper elbows. That the Senate can vote, restoration, and wake to discover it has embalmed something still breathing. In the decade after Sulla's death, the Republic would try to forget the smell of the lists. It would prosecute a few mid-level butchers, restore tribunician powers, and applaud when Pompey and Crassus unwound parts of the Sullan constitution to buy grace. But the pathway had been paved. Generals could consult legions about law. Governors could estimate price in heads as well as in denarii. Citizens could learn to read the rostra as a place where rhetoric and skulls shared space. When Caesar weighed a small river in his mind and found it shallow in 49, he was not inventing disobedience. He was reading Sulla's chalk marks on the door and deciding that the auction still had lots unsold. Call it a handshake you weren't invited to witness, forged in a city where elections sounded like lawsuits and lawsuits sounded like wars. By the 60s BC, Rome had too many calendars, Sulla's restored schedule, the tribunes revived impatience, governors elongated years, and generals' diaries written in laurel. 3 men decided to staple those pages together. None of them loved colleagues. All of them preferred results. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, came gilded with victories and a young man's appetite for applause. Marcus Licinius Crassus, richest man in Rome, came with money, clients, and a chip measured in talents. Gaius Julius Caesar, clever, popular, and in a hurry, came with debts, charm, and sentences that ended in action. The prelude is all elbows. Pompey, after clearing the Mediterranean of pirates in 3 crisp months under the extraordinary Lex Gabinia, 67 BC, and reorganizing the East against Mithridates under the Lex Manilia, 66, returned in 62 with a triumph that lasted 2 days and a request: please ratify my settlements, please find land for my veterans. The Senate, jealous of popularity that could blow hats off heads at 100 paces, stalled. Crassus, who had funded much and forgiven more, nursed grievances. His suppression of Spartacus' slave revolt, 71, shared the spotlight with Pompey, who claimed to have finished the war on the roads by killing stragglers. Caesar, meanwhile, climbed with theater, Edau's games, Pontifex Maximus, 63, campaign run from a house stuffed with creditors' IOUs, praetorship, 62, and a keen reading of Rome's emotional weather. When his bid for a provincial command with muscle encountered senatorial frost, he sketched a triangle. The deal itself, modern scholars call it the first triumvirate. The men did not, was simple enough. Caesar would have the consulship of 59 BC. Pompey would get his eastern settlements ratified and land for his veterans. Crassus would secure policies favorable to the equestrian tax farming companies in Asia, whose bids had proved over-optimistic, and both would receive future leverage through Caesar's provincial command. The glue was private. Pompey married Caesar's daughter Julia, whose grace and good sense lubricated a partnership the men's pride would otherwise have soured. Caesar's charm bridged the old rivalry between the other two. They agreed to agree in private when public institutions disagreed in public. Caesar's consulship looked like a practicum in bending procedure without breaking it, at least not in a way that couldn't be called creative. His colleague, Bibulus, an optimist, declared he would watch the skies for omens, code for obstruct everything. Caesar moved assemblies to the forum where crowds could vote. Soldiers on leave mingled with voters. Pompey attended with veterans, a reminder that policy had a marching band. Land for Pompey's troops passed. Tax relief for the publicani in Asia passed. The record of Pompey's eastern settlement received senatorial teeth. Bibulus, after having his consul's chair pelted with offal, retreated to his house and claimed to be taking the auspices. Rome, with the cruelty of the amused, nicknamed the year the consulship of Julius and Caesar. Mainstream fact, written as a docket, the alliance coalesced in late 60. Caesar's consulship in 59 advanced the land Lex Julia Agraria and ratified Pompey's acts. Crassus obtained remission for Asian tax companies. Caesar received the provincia of Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum for 5 years, later joined by Transalpine Gaul, an unusually long term secured through a Lex Vitinia. Pompey married Julia, 59. Caesar married Calpurnia. Public life and private life interlocked like cogs greased with dowries. Opposition, led by Cato the Younger, fought with speeches, filibusters, and lawyering, but numbers and muscle combined to pass the bundle. Then Caesar left the city and became a geography lesson. In Gaul from 58 onward, he fought Helvetii migrations, beat Ariovistus the German across the Rhine, subjugated Belgae, stormed coastal tribes, wrote crisp commentary that made triumph sound like syntax, crossed the Channel to Britain twice, 55, 54, to audition for legend, bridged the Rhine to audition for physics, and trained legions into a family whose surname was Victory. The alliance's arithmetic had been: Caesar gets glory in armies, Pompey gets dignity and administration at home, Crassus gets money and a shot at matching military fame. Crassus' shot misfired at Carrhae, 53 BC. Having secured a command in Syria through a law resembling the earlier extraordinary grants, thank the alliance's precedent and people's appetite, he marched against Parthia, a cavalry and arrow empire comfortable on open sands. At Carrhae, Serina's horse archers and cataphracts turned Roman cohorts into thirsty facts. Crassus' son Publius died in a cavalry disaster. Crassus himself perished in a parley gone to poison. Ancient writers gloat with theater. Molten gold poured down his throat as a moral about greed. Modern caution notes that cruelty is a playwright, not a stenographer. What matters? One corner of the triangle vanished. A river of Roman pride ran into eastern dust. Quirky tidbit: Pompey, the world's most competent extrovert, kept a theater complex in Rome, finished 55 BC, whose porticos offered politics and shade and sculpture in every rhetorical style. Rome's first permanent stone theater, smuggled past purists by attaching a small temple so the seats could be steps to the gods. Another, Caesar's bridge over the Rhine used piles driven by swinging rams and braces set at angle. He left it standing just long enough for the message to arrive. "We can come and go," and then took it down like a man who tidies after a demonstration. Julia's death and childbirth, 54 BC, cut the alliance's softest cord. Pompey's later marriage into the Metelli drew him back toward the conservative bloc. With Crassus gone, balance failed. The Senate, sensing opportunity to redomesticate politics, leaned on ancient awkwardness. Caesar could not stand for a second consulship in absentia. His command would expire. If he returned as a private man, indictments awaited. If he remained in Gaul, illegality did. The boni, self-branded, the good men, pressed Pompey to be the city's firewall. Clodius and Milo's gang warfare, the burning of the Senate House, 52, at Clodius' funeral, and the murder that occasioned it shoved voters toward a single strong consul to restore order. Pompey accepted a sole consulship, constitutionally odd but rhetorically soothing. Mainstream aside, clean as a court minute, the Lex Pompeia de Provinciis complicated Caesar's path home. The Senate voted that Caesar lay down command by a date. Curio, once Caesar's opponent turned ally, cleverly proposed that both Pompey and Caesar relinquish their commands. The double disarmament, motion that revealed sides like lake water reveals stones in a drought. It passed in the tribal assembly. The Senate ignored it. January 49 BC, the Senate issued the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree, empowering consuls to protect the state, language history had learned to fear. Caesar, at Ravenna, read it as a choice between prosecution and preemption. Historians still argue whether the alliance was a conspiracy against the Republic or an ad hoc restraint on senatorial obstructionism. Was it oligarchic collusion that privatized the state, or a temporary cartel that lubricated governance in a city choking on vetoes? Another line of debate: did Pompey ever intend to be Caesar's equal, or did he misread a younger man's speed? Was Caesar's Gallic war defensive, responding to migrations and threats, or elective, crafted for glory? Ancient propaganda is loud. Cicero's letters show ambivalence. Sallust's prefaces lament a moral slide. Caesar's commentaries perform reasonableness with an actor's smile. Cato's admirers canonize in hard marble. Modern split. Some see structural rot, others bad luck welded to bad actors. Light joke 1. Romans quip that the first triumvirate had 3 chairs, one for power, one for money, and one for grammar. Caesar's commentaries. Light joke 2. Bibulus claimed to have spent his consulship watching the sky. A wit replied that the sky didn't notice. Light joke 3. After Pompey's theater opened, a censor muttered that Rome would now sit more and think less. A spectator answered that sitting improves listening. The censor fined the reply for impertinence. What is less debated is the alliance's constitutional effect. It normalized extraordinary commands as solutions to legislative stalemate. It taught ambitious men that policy could be traded privately and then bulldozed publicly. It linked land bills to veteran expectations. It inserted private affection, Julia's marriage, into public stability in a way that made bereavement a state event. The Senate, clinging to custom and worried about precedent, fought with adjournments and prodigy reports. The triumvirs fought with crowds, Marenglace Latin, and the quiet suggestion that soldiers were voting with their boots. Meanwhile, in the East and West, administration matured in the shadow of the handshake. Pompey's eastern settlements stuck, client kings, Herod's father Antipater beginning his family's rise, Galatian chieftains with Greek lettering on their seals, learned to tune their flutes to Roman key. Cities received charters. Pirates became farmers in inland colonies where sea was a rumor. Caesar's Gaul became a laboratory, roads, winter quarters that bit into local politics, legions with numbers that later would be imperial myths, the 10th, the 13th, and reports that turned logistics into literature. Crassus' failure taught a lasting lesson about Parthian arrows and the need for cavalry not paid in overconfidence. The alliance's end approached like theater you can smell before the curtain rises. With the ultimum decree posted, with Curio's compromise trashed, with tribunes Marcus Antonius and Quintus Cassius fleeing Caesar's camp to dramatize threat, Caesar chose motion. His letters, quoted by later writers, present a man pleading legality. His legions, seasoned, paid, loyal, presented reality. The Rubicon, a small stream swollen by ideas, ran between personal command and public law. Crossing it would make the Civil War Sulla rehearsed into a longer, subtler script. But that is the next act. Quirky tidbit 2, when Caesar held the Coni Oratio, oath-taking, of his legions before marching, some soldiers joked about the die cast line long before Suetonius found a Greek tag, Aneryphtho kubos, to embroider it. Another, Pompey, who had once been called Agilus Sentiulus Carnifex, the teenage butcher, for his early harshness, discovered in middle age a preference for legality and lawns. Critics said he had grown boring. Admirers said he had grown constitutional. In the end, the triumvirate was less an institution than a method, Identify the pieces of the state that resist you, combine resources until they don't, and call the result restoration, salvation, or simple efficiency. It worked while Julia lived and while Crassus breathed. It faltered when grief and sand intervened. The Republic, already bruised by Sulla's lists and Marius' mules, now had to decide whether armies could be ballots and whether ballots could be obeyed without armies watching. You can summarize the decade with 3 exchanges. Caesar traded debts for time, then time for legions, then legions for the right to speak in the imperative. Pompey traded glory for guardianship, and discovered that guardianship without monopoly is a promise to be disappointed. Crassus traded coin for command and discovered that Parthia's archers accept no currency but caution. Rome, for its part, traded procedures for peace and discovered that neither stays long when men learn how to price them. The handshake that began in a private room ended at a riverbank. The city had hoped to run on schedules. It would now run on campaigns. In the morning, after Bibulus omens and Julia's smiles, after theaters and tax bids, after Britain's chalk cliffs and Syria's arrows, the forum looked the same, but everyone could feel the floorboards creak. The next step would be wet. The next sentences would be written with marching feet. Night in Ravenna smells like wet rope and decisions. Caesar stands with a map that has learned his fingerprints, and with legions that have learned his voice. In Rome, the Senate's ultimum decretum hangs in the air like winter breath. Pompey, now the state's champion, holds consular authority and the loyalty of many nobles. Tribunes who sided with Caesar have fled to him as living arguments that law has been manhandled. Between camp and capital lies a narrow, inconvenient noun, the Rubicon, the boundary of his province. Cross as a private man with a general's shadow, and you write treason, stay, and you accept a trial he believes is a verdict in search of a courtroom. He chooses motion. The die is cast, the later story says. The earlier man probably murmurs something nearer to, let the die be cast. A grammarian's comfort that fate can take the blame. The 13th Legion steps. Standards shrug off drizzle. The small river does its best to be history and water at once. Customs men who used to tax mules for panniers will later remember they inadvertently monitored a constitutional revolution. Caesar sends letters ahead, arguing in the calm voice he keeps for contentious facts. He is defending tribunes. He proposes reciprocal disarmament. He prefers negotiation. He is already on the road. Panic is a poor administrator. In Rome, Pompey evacuates magistrates and senators toward Capua, then Brundisium, southeast to ports and to the fleets that make time polite. Caesar moves like a sentence that refuses subordinate clauses, Ariminum and Picenum taken with speed and clemency. Towns that open gates keep their councils and their dignity. Officers who prefer Pompey are allowed to depart with their swords and their pride. He writes to the Senate from each stair, calling his haste. Peace with a schedule. The city, short on troops, long on rhetoric, discovers that argument does poorly against momentum. Mainstream fact set out like a military return. January 49 BC, Caesar crosses the Rubicon with Legio XIII, Pompey, consuls, and many senators withdraw. Caesar secures Italy within months largely bloodlessly. In March he is named dictator briefly to hold elections, then consul. He marches to Spain against Pompeian legates Afranius and Petreius. I go to meet an army without a leader before I meet. A leader without an army defeats them at Alerta. Pompey consolidates in the east. 48 BC brings Pharsalus in Thessaly. Caesar's smaller, veteran force outmaneuvers Pompey's larger army. Pompey flees to Egypt and is assassinated on the shore. Caesar arrives, weeps at the offered head, and becomes entangled in Alexandria's palace politics. The Alexandrian War ends with Cleopatra established as queen and an alliance minted. 47 to 46 BC sees campaigns in Pontus, Zela, Vani, Vidi, Vici, Africa, Thapsus, and Spain again, Munda, 45. In Rome, Caesar accrues honors, multiple consulships, dictator first for months, then for a year, then dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, early 44 BC. On the Ides of March, senators led by Brutus and Cassius assassinate him in the theater of Pompey. Speed is not the only tool, clemency is the style. Caesar makes a policy of clementia. Captured senators are pardoned and returned to public life. Former enemies dine at his table and later at his legislation. It is magnanimity as politics, advertised in coins and in speeches. It disarms opposition one man at a time, and breeds resentments that learn to speak in daggers. Alongside mercy runs administrative appetite. Caesar legislates as if the Republic had always been waiting for a planner. Debt relief light enough to calm creditors. Land for veterans without sullen brutality. Calendars corrected so months will stop slipping like bad sandals. The Lex Julia Municipalis regularizes local government. The Senate's numbers are enlarged with Italians and provincials, a move both inclusive and insulting to old nobilities. Grain distributions are rationalized. Luxury laws nip extravagance. Colonies plant Roman veterans at Carthage and Corinth like punctuation reintroduced into old sentences. Light joke 1. When Caesar unveils the calendar reform. Our Julian year. Someone complains that birthdays will now arrive predictably. A poet replies. That predictability is what birthdays wanted all along. Light joke 2. Asked why he pardons enemies who will surely plot again, Caesar says, I prefer to make more friends than corpses. A veteran mutters, friends don't hold lines. Light joke 3. When the month Quintilis is renamed July in his honor, a wit suggests renaming February, fees, for the tax office. The censors do not applaud. Pharsalus becomes the fulcrum history can find on a map. Plains dust, river to the west, the Pompeian cavalry massed on Caesar's weak right. Caesar hides a fourth line of cohorts behind his cavalry, men trained to stab at faces and horses in a way that offends poetry and delights tactics. Pompey's horse charge breaks on that hedge of discipline. Caesar's right counterattacks. The Pompeian infantry, crowded and badly managed, buckles. Pursued ruins what orderly retreat might have saved. Afterward, Caesar walks the field not as a butcher but as a bookkeeper of grief. He forbids monuments to his victory and writes a dispatch without trumpet flourishes. I came, I saw, I conquered, belongs to Zella and stood precisely because Pharsalus was too intimate to brag about. Egypt is theater turned policy. Cleopatra 7 enters wrapped in legend and linen. Caesar, besieged in the palace district, fights a city while watching a dynasty argue with knives. The Pharos burns, accidents devour scrolls and ships. The Nile becomes a blue ally. The war ends with Ptolemy 13 dead and Cleopatra enthroned with a younger brother for form. Caesar lingers long enough for rumor to write a chapter. A child, Caesarion, later complicates suits in Rome. But Egypt is also logistics, grain and gold promised, an eastern flank soothed. He takes a tour of the Nile like a man who knows how rivers think. Ion Pontus, Mithridates' son Pharnaces tests the sentimental value of revenge. Caesar, in a hurry, takes a straight line to Zella and wins in 5 days from arrival to departure. Veni, vidi, vici works as PR because the verb in the middle is short. Africa brings Cato and the Optimates to Thapsus. Elephants and stubbornness fail. Cato dies at Utica by his own hand, taking with him a brand of austere republicanism that will later feed memory more than policy. Spain at Munda is tough. Caesar's veterans strain, almost buckle, and then rescue their general's myth with late grit. I have fought many battles, he says afterward, but this is the first I have fought for my life. Quirky tidbit. The Julian calendar reform, 46 BC, added days to bring the year back into alignment. 46 was the Annus Confusionis, the year of confusion. With 445 days, clerks grumbled, astronomers smiled, and festival caterers aged visibly. Another, Caesar's chair of ivory and his laurel wreath, worn in part to hide a receding hairline, became semi-sacred props. When senators rose at his approach, some thought honor, others theater. Both were right. Honors piled like cushions until they looked like a throne. Temples to Clementia, statues among the kings, a perpetual dictatorship, the title parens patri, father of the fatherland, a special curule seat, a house on the forum. He refuses the diadem in public when Antony, drunk on Lupercalia and the opportunity to be memorable, presses it. The crowd is chilly. Caesar orders the diadem deposited in Jupiter's temple, a gesture of republican modesty that convinces almost nobody wearing a memory. He plans Parthian war, provincial reforms, and a Rome recut along rational lines. The city hears efficiency and monarchy in the same sentence and disagrees about which word is louder. Historians still argue the question that can't stop: was Caesar a tyrant or the doctor the body needed, curing senatorial sclerosis with executive surgery? Did the Republic die in 49 or long before, in Sulla's marches, in the social war's aftermath, in agrarian rot and provincial exploitation? Was the assassination a defense of liberty, or an elite's bid to reclaim a monopoly it had squandered? Sources are choirs with agendas. Caesar's own commentary outperform moderation. Cicero's letters show admiration curdled with dread. Plutarch writes morality plays. Appian tallies and sighs. Modern scholarship splits between structuralists, the machine had already seized, and voluntarists. A handful of men made choices that mattered. The only uncontested fact is that daggers make poor constitutions. The Ides of March arrive without thunder. The Senate meets not in the Curia, under repair, but in Pompey's theater complex, a room that has stored applause and will now store a murder. The conspirators, 60 or thereabout, arrange flattery into a circle. Tilius Cimber presents a petition. Hands reach for the purple. Steel appears. Servilius Casca strikes first and badly. The rest learn anatomy in public. Caesar falls at the base of Pompey's statue, the city's two greatest egos meeting as stone and blood. You too, child? Kai su, teknon? The line later assigned to Caesar for Brutus is too neat for stenography, but it captures the ache of a man who had made clemency his brand and found it did not include immunity. Light joke, the last, and gentle after the deed, a few assassins try to improvise a speech on liberty. The crowd listens the way cats listen to recipes. Another, one conspirator nicks his own arm and claims the wound is a badge of freedom. A physician offers him an actual bandage and suggests fewer metaphors. A third, someone proposes a festival to Libertas Restituta. A practical edile asks who is paying. The motion is referred to a committee that never meets. In the stunned days after, Antony reads Caesar's will, discovers bequests to the people, and shows them the bloody toga. Political theater that turns sympathy into a weather system. Octavian, the quiet 19-year-old heir, arrives to claim a name and, eventually, a world. Brutus and Cassius, surprised that the Republic does not reboot when you press a senator, drift toward provinces and war. The vacuum that follows a strong planner is not filled by procedure. It is filled by the men who can hire procedure, and failing that, legions. Quirky tidbit 2, Caesar's house contained a private library open to scholars. After his death, librarians became curators of factions, guarding scrolls that each side wanted to quote. Another, the comet that blazed over Rome during games in Caesar's honor in 44 was read as his soul becoming a star. Augustus would later park it on his coins as propaganda and astronomy in one. The sentence that began at a small river ends under a larger shadow. Caesar crossed in the name of law he said had been bent against him. He ruled with a speed that felt like oxygen after suffocation to some and like a hand closing to others. He fell to men who believed the curve of his trajectory could only end in a crown. What followed? Proscriptions renewed, Philippi, Perusia, Actium, belongs to successors who learned from both his successes and his vulnerabilities. But the grammar changed with him. In the Republic you asked, argued, and voted your way forward. With Caesar you commanded, planned, and apologized later with statues. If you want a summary that annoys everyone equally, Caesar proved that a brilliant administrator with legions can teach a sclerotic polity to move, and that brilliance plus legions terrifies those who think movement will never stop. He left Rome with a better calendar, safer harbors, more colonists, tidier accounts, a broader senate, and a question mark where consent had once been a period. On the Ides, a city that had learned to live with genius tried to live without him. It will not find that easy. But that is the next march. The knife did not restore the calendar. It tore it. Into the tear stepped 3 men who proposed to staple time back together with laws that sounded like thunder. Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, Octavian to enemies, the teenage heir with an older man's appetite, Marcus Antonius, Caesar's colleague and showman, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, Pontifex Maximus and institutional glue, discovered that private arrangements could be written in statute. At Bologna, in late 43 BC they swore a pact. In Rome the Lex Titia made it legal, a 5-year board of 3 for the reconstitution of the state. Tres viri rei publici constituendi. The Republic, lately stabbed for monarchy, now received a junta with letterhead. The first policy was memory management. Proscription lists went up again, neat as ledgers and twice as cruel. Rewards for heads, confiscations for estates, disabilities for sons, Sulla's template with updated typography. Cicero, who had tried to steer Antony with speeches and found that rhetoric phrase under steel, became the most famous entry. His attempts to flee ended at Formi. His head and hands were nailed to the rostra where his voice had so often won afternoons. Anecdote paints Fulvia, Antony's wife, piercing his tongue with a hairpin. It is the kind of intimate theater ancient authors love and modern caution distrusts. What is incontestable is the arithmetic. Thousands named, fortunes inverted, veterans promised land funded by absence. The board purchased the future by selling the past. Mainstream fact, orderly as a court roll, the Lex Titia, November 43, established the triumvirate for 5 years, renewed later. Proscriptions began almost immediately. The triumvirs raised huge armies from veterans and new levies. 2 armies of Caesar's killers, Brutus and Cassius, gathered in the east, rich with Asia's taxes and sincerity. 42 BC, 2 battles at Philippi and Macedonia. In the first, Cassius, misreading dust and fate, committed suicide. In the second, Brutus' line broke. He fell on his sword. The liberators' cause died on a hill the sources remember with sonorous regret. The victors divided the Mediterranean like a merchant divides stock. Antony took the east, Octavian the west, with Italy as the awkward common pantry, Lepidus Africa as consolation and potential. While legions cooled, Italy heated. Land for veterans required displacement. Municipalities coughed up farms and resentments. Octavian learned what it is to be hated with legal cover. Perusine War, 41 to 40 BC, followed. Lucius Antonius, Antony's brother, and Fulvia rallied discontent under a banner reading, "For the Republic," a slogan elastic enough to clothe any grievance. Octavian besieged Perusia through winter. Famine ate ideology. The town surrendered. The leaders lived, many Perusians did not. Altars smoked with a sacrifice later rumor grew into shadows. Fulvia fled east to her husband, died en route in Sicyon, and left Europe more available to a treaty. Brundisium, 40 BC, patched the quarrel. Antony and Octavian met with armies staring like dogs on short leashes. Parleys, poetry, and pragmatism produced a new map. Antony confirmed in the east, Octavian in the west. Lepidus kept Africa but not the microphone. Cement for the deal came in a marriage, Antony to Octavian's sister, Octavia, a woman Roman writers will cast as patience in human form. The wedding officiated in armistice. The year closed with smiles that felt stitched out. If the land was Octavian's problem, the sea was everybody's. Sextus Pompeius, son of Pompey the Great, turned Sicily into a floating customs office and blockade, styling himself son of Neptune, and squeezing Rome's grain throat. The Treaty of Misenum, 39 BC, bought a pause, recognition and titles for Sextus, grain and calm for Italy, but treaties prefer teeth. Sextus' harbors still stank of leverage. Skirmishes resumed. Octavian's answer was an engineer in a general's cloak, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. In 37 BC, while Antony and Octavian renewed the triumvirate at Tarentum, Antony lending ships, Octavian men, Agrippa cut a channel to create Portus Aegialius near Naples, trained crews, invented a boarding hook the sources call the harpax, and built ravens for a new century. At Naulochus, 36 BC, he shredded Sextus' fleet. Sicily fell. Sextus fled and would be hunted down. Octavian breathed. Rome ate bread without speeches. Lepidus, who had imagined Africa as a springboard, instead found it a trapdoor. Arriving with legions to claim Sicily after Naulochus, he tried to convert assistance into ownership. Octavian converted his soldiers into defections. Stripped of troops and dignity, Lepidus kept the title of Pontifex Maximus but lost the rest. The triumvirate, in practice, had become a duet. Antony's east bloomed and festered together. He wintered in Athens as a Philhellene, marched against Parthia in 36 BC along routes that had humbled Crassus, and discovered that logistics is a jealous god. Armenian corridors, Parthian horse archers, supply wagons too few, retreat under harassment. His campaign retreated with heavy adjectives. Yet Antony still had resources, charisma, and a queen who understood both. Cleopatra VII of Egypt, now his ally and lover, supplied ships, money, and theater. The so-called donations of Alexandria, 34 BC, made a show of Eastern grandeur. Children by Cleopatra styled kings of kings. Territories parceled like stage props. Cleopatra hailed. Queen of kings. Antony. Dionysus Osiris. In some accounts, Hellenistic spectacle flavored with Roman anxiety. In Rome, Octavian read these headlines with deliberate literalism. Quirky tidbit. When Agrippa built Portus Aegialius, he sunk old hulks to reinforce breakwaters, planted willows for revetments, and trained crews in a basin where wind behaved like a disciplined idea. He also revived an ancient tactic, a grapnel launched by torsion engines, that let Roman marines turn naval maneuvers into infantry conversations. Another, Antony's Parthian disaster was not total. He saved much of his army through grim marching, but the gossip outmarched him, turning retreat into ritual humiliation over Roman dinner tables. The propaganda war sharpened its quills. Octavian, owning Italy's hunger and municipal gratitude, minted coins with Caesar's comet, Divus Aegialius now a star, while presenting himself as Divi Filius, son of a god. Antony countered with Dionysiac flourish and Greek city adoration, but in Italy the optics of an Eastern court with Egyptian perfume soured easily. Octavia, dutiful in the West while her husband lived in the East, became Rome's living rebuke by example. Letters were read on the rostra, wills became theater. Antony's alleged testament, leaked, Octavian swore, from the Vestal's custody, named burial in Alexandria and bequests that sounded foreign to ears trained on the Tiber. Whether authentic or edited, it played well with an audience rehearsed by decades of US versus East, while still mourning Parthian embarrassment. Historians still argue whether the triumvirate was inevitable consolidation or opportunist predation. Was Lex Titia a legal fig leaf over naked force? or an honest attempt to stabilize a state that had exhausted its normal tools? Did the Perusian executions include sacrificial atrocity or later libel? Was Antony's Parthian failure misplanned, or sabotaged by Armenian unreliability and Parthian genius? Did the donations of Alexandria signal a bid to carve an Eastern monarchy apart from Rome, or were they standard Hellenistic pageantry made scandalous by Roman jealousy? On Sextus Pompey, too, the ledger is double: pirate to some, last republican to others. He enforced a blockade but offered treaties. He claimed ancestral gravitas and practiced maritime rent-seeking. The sources, Appian, Dio, Plutarch, are verbose and partisan in different densities. Archaeology gives you anchors and amphorae, less good for motives. Light joke 1. A wag in Rome said the triumvirs were like a three-legged table missing a floor, steady until anyone touched it. Light joke 2. After Naulicus, Agrippa was offered a golden naval crown, corona navalis. He said it pinched. Octavian told him that was the point. Light joke 3. Octavia's friends reportedly teased that she had married two men, one in Athens and one in the Forum. She replied that at least one of them wrote, and even mailed, thank you notes. The legal facade mattered even when swords did the convincing. Renewals at Tarentum came with consular elections and oaths. Land distributions came with leges passed in assemblies. Courts still sat, even as jurors read the weather. Coin legends named offices and ablatives of piety. The triumvirs' claim was always that they were restoring a republic misshapen by tyranny and civil blood. Their reality was a controlled economy of violence, patronage, and infrastructure. Colonies founded for veterans, aqueducts extended, temples repaired, roads metalled. The state wore bruises and new shoes at once. By 33 to 32 BC, the duet had become a duel. Antony divorced Octavia after keeping her politely at a door too long. Octavian ramped up the Egyptian narrative. Control of the West meant control of narrative, grain, pay, and Italy's veterans. Control of the East meant wealth, ships, and a queen who could mix charisma with coin. Diplomacy flickered and died. Embassies returned with insults carefully curated for publication. The Senate, asked to decide, found itself again a chorus in a play already rehearsed elsewhere: war against Cleopatra, rather than against Antony, a formula Octavian preferred because it made treason sound like hygiene. Quirky tidbit 2. In this propaganda season, Octavian cultivated a studied plainness: short hair, sober dress, early-to-bed anecdotes. While Antony's coined portraits grew beards and diadem hints when struck in Eastern mints. Numismatics becomes character study. The West's denarii say, peace through law. The East's tetradrachms say, glory through spectacle. Another, municipal Italy put up altars to the peace of Caesar. Years before anybody could define the term, they turned out to be practicing for a regime they hadn't yet named. The reckoning of the triumvirate, then, is not simply the story of men dividing provinces and posting lists. It is also the story of institutions surviving by pretending not to notice that they had changed shape. Elections continued sometimes, courts judged, often, colonies thrived, taxes were collected with receipts, the aerarium and fiscus, public treasury and the war chest, began to learn their separate tricks. The Republic as a legal fiction persisted while the Republic as a power arrangement mutated. By the time fleets mustered at Actium's Bay, the question was no longer whether one man would rule. Events had answered that. But which man, and with which music, Latin civic piety, or Hellenistic courtly splendor harnessed to Roman steel? What came next? Sails, smoke, and a wind that forgot to help Antony, belongs to the next section. For now, the accounts for the triumvirate show the following. Proscriptions paid for armies. Philippi paid for a partition. Sicily paid for bread. Naulicus paid for Octavian's confidence. Parthia charged Antony interest. Alexandria offered Antony a stage and Octavian a script. Lepidus was retired with dignity's shell. Octavia earned a laureate of patience. Agrippa learned that infrastructure wins as many crowns as rhetoric. The Republic, looking at itself in a polished shield, saw an old face with new scars and told itself that scar tissue is still skin. You could chart the end of a century on a gust of wind. Actium, September 2nd, 31 BC, began long before oars bit water, with leaflets disguised as letters, coins pretending to be sermons, and a campaign season in which infrastructure became a weapon. Octavian held Italy, the recruiting ground and the narrative. Antony held the east, the treasure and the ships. Cleopatra held Egypt, the flexible bank. Each tried to persuade the Mediterranean that the other was the problem. Octavian said, "War against a foreign queen, and let senators pretend they were not fighting a Roman." Antony said, "War against an ingrate boy, and let cities remember that he, at least, could fill a theater." The prologue is a chessboard of harbors. Antony massed a large fleet, heavy quinquiremes and larger, inside the Ambracian Gulf near Actium's narrow mouth, shored by fortified camps on the promontories. His admirals, Publius Canidius Crassus on land, Marcus Anstius and others at sea, argued options: march inland with superior infantry, or gamble on ships. Cleopatra urged the sea. Her treasury had built much of what floated. Octavian, not yet a sailor in legend, had Agrippa, already an admiral in fact. While Antony waited, Agrippa raided. He seized Methone and Lucas, cut Antony's supply lines, captured the key base at Patrae, and, deadliest of all, took and closed the naval hub at Corinthian Naupactus. Blockade is a kind of argument that doesn't raise its voice. Antony's rowers heard their rations thinning. Mainstream fact, laid out like a dispatch. 32 to 31 BC, Octavian and Antony's alliance dissolves. Antony divorces Octavia. Octavian publishes, or claims to, Antony's will naming burial in Alexandria and provisions for Cleopatra's children. War is declared on Cleopatra. Spring 31, Octavian and Agrippa advance through western Greece. Agrippa's fleet dominates the approaches. Antony's army, strong in numbers but short on fodder, is pinned with its back to the Gulf. On September 2nd, the fleets meet. Antony sails out with roughly 200 to 230 ships in 3 squadrons. Octavian with about 350 lighter, handier vessels. Cleopatra's squadron of 60 Egyptian ships holds the rear of Antony's line with towering rigs and deep holds. Ocean-going arsenals turned into floating citadels. Quirky tidbit: Agrippa's sailors wore a badge, a small, radiate crown, after he earned the Coronan Novalis at Naulicus. Fishermen in the Bay of Naples copied the look on feast days, proof that fashion follows whoever delivers grain. Another, Antony's flagship carried purple sails on occasion. Plutarch insists they were Cleopatra's. Practical sailors mutter that purple sails stretch badly and advertise you to archers. On the morning, a stiff northwesterly, the maestros puffed crosswise at the Gulf's mouth. Antony had chained for battle. Octavian extended in a wide arc, refusing the center and pressing the wings. The fight, when it began, was not ramming and splinters. These were heavy ships wary of their own momentum, but grappling, boarding, and artillery at close range. Octavian's lighter Liburnians swarmed and harried. Antony's big hulls tried to make their mass count. Archers and engines traded kindling. Hours burned, sails remained gathered, battle fought, as custom, under oars. Then the gesture that turned narrative into fate. Cleopatra's 60, stationed behind, suddenly loosed sails and shot through the gap opening in the battle line, driving for the open sea with the wind like a hired god. Antony, seeing the queen's pennant tilt south, broke the oldest rule of admirals. He followed his logistics and his heart at once. With a handful of ships he punched out after her, leaving the majority of his fleet and many soldiers still engaged. Why? Theories multiply. A prearranged breakout to save treasure, an agreed plan if the line could not be held, panic in the face of fire ships, or a calculated extraction to continue the war from Egypt. The sources disagree because the men who might have confessed turned into ash and rumor died on the water left behind. Command lost the argument. Many of Antony's captains fought on and were captured. Others hauled down colors. Some, unable to break free, burned their own ships. Octavian's victory was not annihilation on the day. It was the closing of a door the enemy had wanted to wedge ajar. Agrippa kept pressure seaward. On land, hunger did the remainder. Antony's army, still substantial and on paper capable, began to melt without pay or purpose. Within weeks, Octavian controlled Greece. Within months, he was ready to carry the decision to Egypt. Light joke 1. A wag in Rome insisted Actium proved love travels faster than orders. A veteran replied that wind travels faster than both. Light joke 2. When someone praised Antony's bold breakout, an old triarch said, "Breaking out is boldest when you remember to bring your army." Light joke 3. Poets tried out lines comparing Cleopatra's sails to swans. A bosun said swans do not tack. Historians still argue whether the scholarly refrain does overtime here. Was Cleopatra the architect of a deliberate escape to preserve Egypt's wealth and fleet, with Antony as co-signer, or did she panic at the sight of fire and seize the weather's favor? Did Antony's departure betray command, or did remaining captains refuse a signal they thought suicidal? Was Agrippa's lighter fleet decisively superior regardless, or did fortune's wind decide an otherwise equal contest? The archaeology of Actium's headland, monuments Octavian later raised showing captured rams nailed like antlers, confirms victory's tone if not each tactical note. Coins and the victory complex at Nicopolis tell you what the winner wanted you to remember. Apollo smiled. The West prevailed. The sea confessed who owned it. What followed is logistics dressed as tragedy. Winter 31 to 30 BC, Octavian moved deliberately. He secured the eastern ports, took surrenders, published amnesties generously where useful, and wrote to Italian municipalities about grain as if war were a scheduling conflict. In 30 he sailed for Egypt. Antony and Cleopatra tried to conjure time, skirmishes near Pelusium, an attempted sortie on the Nile, a cavalry defection they could not reverse. Alexandria, moved by dust and rumor, watched theater become obituary. Antony, misinformed that Cleopatra had killed herself, fell on his sword. Botched, he was carried bleeding to her monument, and died in her arms. A scene the sources report with a playwright's timing because history sometimes indulges those. Cleopatra, captured and guarded, sought an arrangement that might preserve her children and a shred of sovereignty. Octavian, implacably courteous, offered honor without crowns. Days later, August 30th BC by modern count, she died, the asp a later emblem, the method uncertain, the meaning rehearsed by every age according to its appetite for romance or respectability. Mainstream fact again, clipboard steady, Octavian annexed Egypt, placed its immense wealth under his personal control, a patrimonium Caesaris of sorts, and kept senators away. No proconsuls with private ambitions in the Nile's valley. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Caesar, was killed. Too many Caesars is a bad calendar. A grim quip later tradition puts in Octavian's mouth. Antony's older children by Fulvia and by Octavia survived. Cleopatra's children by Antony were paraded in Octavian's triple triumph, 29 BC, in miniature regalia, spectacle in Rome's registered key. Octavian closed the doors of Janus Temple as a sign of peace, founded Nicopolis near Actium to commemorate victory, and began the long, gentle work of making one-man rule look like everyone's idea. Quirky tidbit 2, the Victory Monument at Actium displayed bronze rams taken from enemy ships along a terrace. Their sockets can still be traced. Each ram had been bolted to a prow like a promise, and then pried off like a receipt. Another, Nicopolis, city of victory, was peopled with settlers drawn from surrounding Greek towns. Poets complained about forced moves. Stonemasons did not. They were employed. Actium's importance is not that it was the largest sea fight or the bloodiest. It is that it edited the cast list. With Antony and Cleopatra gone, there was no rival with legal Roman charisma and enough ships to contest the narrative. Sextus Pompey had already been erased. Lepidus lived, declawed. The Senate could applaud or decorate, not decide. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, could now announce that he had rescued the Republic from internal war and external queen, a sentence that tasted like civic virtue even as it institutionalized something new. The victory also determined the empire's fiscal geography. Egypt's grain and gold became a reservoir that made future policy possible. Donatives for troops, spectacles for Rome, marble for forums, patience for provinces. Light joke too. When Octavian promised to restore the Republic after Actium, a veteran asked whether restore meant like the old couch, or like the new one that looks old but doesn't wobble. The veteran got his allotment. The couch question took longer. Freedom survived as a word carved on altars. Obedience survived as a habit taught by bread and quiet harbors. Actium gave Augustus the authority to stage the most delicate performance in Roman political history, returning power to the Senate with one hand, keeping the real levers in the other, and convincing a weary world that the arrangement was modest. That performance is our next scene. For now, the sea has flat water and a built monument. The rams oxidized politely in their sockets. The wind that chose a side has gone back to moving fishermen and rumors. Nicopolis streets carry sandals that do not know they are walking on propaganda. In Rome, a young man plans a triple triumph that will last 3 days. Illyricum, Actium, Egypt, 3 curtains falling, 1 regime rising. The Senate writes decrees. The mints copy the new script onto silver. Apollo, tutelary god of Actium in Octavian's telling, acquires a new temple on the Palatine, conveniently near the house of the man who will soon be called Augustus. Historians will continue to argue whether the outcome was inevitable from Philippi onward, whether Antony ever had a real chance after Naulochus, whether Cleopatra was the decisive variable or the most memorable. But even the skeptics signed the receipt. Actium decided who would define what republic meant in official Latin for the next 40 years. It replaced plural ambitions with a singular calendar, left a handful of corpses and a nation of survivors, and taught Rome to prefer a quiet sea to a noisy Senate. The state exhaled. The young victor turned to the art of looking old-fashioned. And the century that began with Sulla's march toward the Forum ended with a fleet sailing away from monarchy while building one. You wake into a Rome that has decided it prefers careful sentences to loud speeches. The young victor of Actium trims his hair, softens his voice, and begins the most ambitious magic trick in civic history. He returns power while never letting go. You watch him do it not with trumpets, but with paperwork, marble, and a vocabulary that sounds allergic to crowns. He starts in 27 BC with a performance historians still teach. In the Senate he hands back provinces and armies, the heavy furniture of sovereignty, and the senators, tired, flattered, worried, hand them forward again. For the safety of the state. They add a new name to his old one, Augustus, the August, the consecrated. He accepts the provinces that actually need legions, Spain, Gaul, Syria, Egypt, while restoring the quieter ones to senatorial management. Thus is born a two-speed empire, senatorial provinces with proconsuls who wear dignity and thin garrisons, and imperial provinces with legates who wear obedience and thick ones. Over these, Augustus holds imperium maius, a greater command than any governors, and from 23 BC, Tribunitia potestas, tribunician power without sitting on the plebeian bench, annual, renewable, the legal skin of his voice in Rome. He is not king, he is princeps, first, among senators, the citizen who sits a little higher so the calendar remembers to behave. Mainstream fact, neat as an inscription, settlement of 27 BC divides provinces. The title Augustus granted, imperium meius and later tribunician power make his orders portable. The aerarium, state treasury. In Saturn's temple persists for senatorial business while the fiscus, the princeps treasury, emerges to fund legions and administration. Egypt becomes a special case, governed by an equestrian prefect and off-limits to senators, no rival building a private Nile. The legionary establishment settles around 28 units, supported by standardized auxilia cohorts, an alii of non-citizen troops who can earn citizenship by service. In the city, he adds urban cohorts for policing and, in 6C, the vigiles, a night watch and fire brigade whose buckets and pumps save forums from becoming torches. He hires intimacy as policy. The Praetorian Guard, first a dispersed bodyguard, coalesces into elite cohorts under prefects. They protect the person who pretends he needs no protection. They will later become a weather vane for succession. For now, they are the quiet hinge on which doors close smoothly. Administration widens its doorway to equestrians, career managers who are not senators, prefects of Egypt, of the grain supply, Anona, of the city watch, procurators who count what others boast about. Governors' terms lengthen, audits harden, provincial boundaries are drawn with an accountant's pencil rather than a general's bows. Quirky tidbit. In early years Augustus used a signet with a sphinx, then one with his patron Capricorn, astrology as letterhead. He wore simple clothes woven at home by Livia and other women of the household, and when flatterers tried, Lord Dominus, he reminded them the word belongs to gods and head builders. His house on the Palatine, by design, was modest next to the temple of Apollo he built. Architecture as ethics homework. Marble follows the policy like punctuation. He brags, accurately, that he found Rome brick and left it marble. The Forum of Augustus opens with the Temple of Mars altar, Mars the Avenger, promised long ago for vengeance on Caesar's killers and now doing double duty as a court with columns. The Era Pacis, altar of peace, wraps dynastic processions in vines and religious calm. The mausoleum of Augustus on the Campus Martius becomes a planned memory, a round answer to what lasts. The doors of Janus' temple shut to announce, no war, a rare boast in Republican centuries, now a brand. On coins the comet of Caesar glows, but beside it you find corners, altar, and laurel. Victory has learned to be domestic. Law walks with him like a clerk carrying folders. The leges Julii, 18 to 17 BC, tinker with marriage and morality, incentives for wedlock and children among the elite, penalties for stubborn celibates, procedures for trying adultery, a crime now moved from whispers to court. They are half social engineering, half theater. They allow Augustus to posture as the state's patient father. He becomes Pontifex Maximus in 12 BC after Lepidus' long afterlife ends. In 2 BC the city hails him Pater Patri, father of the fatherland. You note the grammar, not king, never king, but father, high priest, first senator. The crown dissolved into offices that sound like favors rather than commands. Light joke 1. When the month Sextilis is renamed August, someone grumbles it now has fewer days than July. Helpful astronomers add a day. And Romans discover you can reform the sky by committee if you own enough temples. Light joke 2. A wag claims the vigiles have reduced fires by drinking the ale they were supposed to throw on flames. The prefect of the watch finds the ale. Light joke 3. When Augustus closes Janus' doors again, a boy asks if that means bedtime for the legions. His father says no, it means they sleep with their boots on. I in the provinces. Peace means roads that stop apologizing for mud. The cursus publicus, a state courier system, grows from ad hoc requisitions into relay stations with fresh meals and official tablets, turning imperial letters into a weather system that arrives predictably. City councils, curiae bull, keep tax and justice humming. Client kings, Herod in Judea, Juba II in Mauritania, wear diadems on leases that can be revoked. Veterans plant colonies that look like Rome written smaller. Grid streets, forum, temple. Latin spreads with deeds and drill. Augustus writes his report card in the residential gesti, an autobiographical inscription posted on bronze before his house and copied in Greek and Latin around the empire. Deeds narrated as gratitude, generosity tallied as policy. Historians still argue the metronome question: is this a restored republic, whose gears have simply been oiled, or a monarchy in toga, its crown stored in the adjectives princeps and Augustus? Structuralists point to imperium maius and tribunician power, to the fiscus, to the monopoly on legions, to Egypt as a private treasury, and say monarchy. Constitutional romantics point to elections that still occur, to senators who still debate, to courts that still convene, and say restoration with a manager. Most agree that Augustus' genius is to make obedience feel like participation, and to make participation safe by being predictable. Not every line stays straight. In 9c, 3 legions under Varus are annihilated in the Teutoburg forest. The news reaches Rome like a storm through shutters. "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions!" Augustus allegedly cries, and the empire quietly steps back from deep Germany to the Rhine and Danube. Frontier policy settles into patience, forts at river lines, client tribes beyond, punitive raids when arithmetic requires, but no more headlong dreaming of Elba and myths. The loss becomes a cautionary footnote under triumphal columns. Quirky tidbit 2, Augustus kept a set of wax tablets for his daybook, appointments, sums, who owed whom a reminder, and an emergency seal kit. He also practiced parrhesia in domestic scale, friends permitted to speak freely at dinner until they confused frankness with grandstanding and were gently invited to try the same on a magistrate. He ate little, slept light, and Suetonius loves this, took the winter sun behind a window like a lizard with good manners. Succession is the riddle he can postpone but not solve. He promotes able kin as if talent were hereditary. Marcellus dies young, Agrippa, indispensable, then gone, Gaius and Lucius, adopted grandsons, both dead by 2 and 4c, then Tiberius, reluctant and reliable, adopted as son. Monuments and marriage laws murmur dynastic hope. The Constitution pretends not to notice. When he dies in 14c at Nola, the Senate decrees him a god, Divus Augustus, and continuity now has a temple. Tiberius inherits not a crown but the keys to a cabinet labeled. Do not call it monarchy. Mainstream aside, tidy as a clerk's whisper, army professionalized with fixed terms, eventually 20+ years for legionaries, 25 for auxiliaries, standardized pay and aerarium militare, military treasury, funded in 6c by new taxes, 5% on inheritances, 1% on auctions, discharge diplomas for auxiliaries granting citizenship. Census extended across Italy and provinces, enabling tax quotas by data rather than by habit. Grain supply stabilized by prefects and Egyptian shipments. Rome gains new aqueducts, an urban layout policed by cohorts. The Senate expanded and then pruned to a working body of dignity rather than riot. The propaganda is soft-spoken and everywhere. Poetry, Virgil's Aeneid, Horace's Odes, sings a Rome that has always been destined for measured greatness. Art shows chaste families and pious sacrifices. Coins knitted together with abbreviations that become a catechism. Caesar Augustus, Pont Max, TRP, Tribunician Power, IMP, Imperator, PP, Pater Patri. He refuses the title, dictator, when offered. he accepts the reality the title once meant. He does not monopolize offices. He monopolizes outcomes. Light joke. Final for tonight. A citizen complains that under Augustus nothing happens suddenly. His wife replies that this is what sleep feels like when the house is finally in order. You, walking the marble he placed and reading the bronze he wrote, may decide the labels later ages apply matter less than the pattern you can touch. The legions stand where rivers advise. The couriers run. The courts sit. The grain arrives. The city does not burn at random. Governors fear audits. Poets find patrons who do not confiscate their houses. The restored republic functions because a single calendar writes it. Whatever the theory, the practice is what Romans long for after a century of eloquent knives. A state that works. By the end of his long management, the empire breathes at a regular pace. Augustus declines to be buried in a crown and accepts immortality in an index. The machine he built hums without his voice because he trained it to, and because the men who inherit it will find it easier to oil than to reinvent. The Republic did not wake from its nap. It learned to sleep with one eye open and a careful hand on the ledger. Tomorrow's label, Empire, will simply catch up with what the sidewalks already know. You step out into a Rome that breathes evenly for the first time in a century, and you can hear the new rhythm in small things. The clack of styluses in a provincial office far from the Tiber, the thud of a surveyor's staff on a frontier road that didn't exist last spring, the satisfied grunt of a legion's mule deciding that this bridge will hold. The Republic storm has settled into an imperial weather report. Predictable fronts, scheduled rains, because a single center now writes the calendar. The word Senate persists, inscribed on arches, whispered in ceremonies, but the verbs have changed. Orders travel faster than rumors. Tax ledgers outlast consuls. A governor is measured less by conquest than by whether the market still opens on time. What Pax Romana means, in your sandals, is this. A soldier posted to a Rhine fort expects his pay, his discharge diploma in 20-odd years, and a plot of land under a sky he can point to by name. A merchant launches oil amphorae from Baetica and can predict the customs due in Ostia within a handful of asses. A city council in Galatia votes a statue to a procurator because the grain arrived warm and the lawsuits cold. A road gang in Africa sets curbstones so straight you could use them to teach geometry to a distracted god. Mainstream fact to pin the mood. From Augustus to Marcus Aurelius, roughly 27 BC to 180 CE, the Mediterranean experiences an unusual span of large-scale peace punctuated by border wars and palace storms, but free of the civil bloodbaths that used to re-edit constitutions. Legions become fixtures. The cursus publicus becomes habit. The imperial court, with its secretaries and prefects, becomes an office where the empire's handwriting learns to be legible. The law grows like a tree whose roots remember the forum and whose branches shade provinces. Jurists, Labio, Sabinus, later Gaius, argue in Latin about contracts and inheritances that travel by donkey. Governors carry praetorian edicts dressed for the road. Municipal charters turn towns into Rome written smaller, with duoviary banging gavels and accents that would have amused Cato. Citizenship spreads by service, favor, and decree. Auxiliaries who start without the franchise end with bronze diplomas naming them citizens, and their children learn to conjugate Latin verbs even if they still swear in local ones. Far later, you file this under maturity. The Constitutio Antoniniana of 212 C will make nearly all free provincials citizens at a stroke. A tax policy to some, a cosmology to others. Quirky tidbit. Those bronze discharge diplomas were hinged like little doors. Veterans wore copies on a thong or kept them in boxes. And somewhere in a dusty attic a grandson found one and used it as a paperweight until a visiting scribe squeaked and rescued great-grandfather's citizenship from a stack of receipts. Another, frontier way stations posted menus, wine watered at honest ratios, bread priced by loaf weight, and a cranky prefect once fined an inn for failing to provide the soldier's portion of olives specified on a wall. Empire is often olives applied reliably. The army's tone changes even as its spine stays steel. Under the early emperors, the standing establishment hovers around 28 legions, each paired with auxiliaries that provide cavalry and archers the citizen line prefers to hire. The eagles still shine, but now they belong to units with long memories of posts and rotations. Rhine this year, Danube next, rather than to ad hoc armies conjured for an ambitious bill in the assembly. Forts along frontiers become towns that pretend to be tents, bathhouses, shrines, workshops, writing tablets where soldiers jot shopping lists and jokes. Bring more socks. The river is opinionated. Light joke 1. A veteran explains that Pax Romana means the barbarians get tired of being told the time. His wife replies that it means he finally eats dinner at home. Augustus' quiet blueprint hardens into precedent and marble. Tiberius inherits reluctance and a working machine. Claudius, administrative at heart, admits senators from Gaul and builds aqueducts as if plumbing were politics. It is. Vespasian taxes urine to fund what urine funds surprisingly well. Trajan plants bridges across the Danube and roads into Dacia, then cuts a clean arch in the Forum to file the paperwork called victory. The empire learns to patrol edges rather than to redraw interiors. The Praetorian Guard discovers its power to applaud loudly. Emperors discover the advantage of sleeping lightly. Yet the provinces mostly notice that milestones accumulate, and that censuses arrive with questions rather than with torches. Historians still argue whether this peace is a velvet glove over a fist or a long truce earned honestly by law and road. Did provinces thrive because Rome enforced contracts and chased pirates? Or did they endure extraction with a smile because resistance was too expensive? Amphory stamps and coin hoards answer an uneasy duet. Trade expands. Inequality does too. They also argue whether the empire's cultural glue is Latin law or Greek leisure. Did Romanitas come to Iberia through courts, or through poets and baths? Sensible people nod to both. The baths have lawyers in them. Light joke 2. A municipal councillor boasts that his town paved a mile of road in a week. A legionary replies they paved a week with a mile of road and prefers it that way. Light joke 3. When a tax collector insists on the correct stamp on an amphora, the shipper mutters that Rome's true empire is over ink. The collector, flattered, waives a fee. The city at the center behaves like a parent who has finally learned bedtime. Fire brigades, vigiles, patrol with pumps and hooks. The grain fleet docks on schedule. The calendar behaves. Forums shimmer. Poets are patronized rather than proscribed. Lawsuits are waged with adjectives instead of spears. The emperor's role, when it works, is to be visible enough to make governors careful and invisible enough that cities feel like the main characters in their own stories. There are disasters, the fire under Nero, the plague under Marcus, but the machine stutters and recovers. A philosopher emperor writes private thoughts about duty that never mention closing Janus doors because he knows those are now always almost shut. Your steps take you to a frontier earthwork where a centurion lectures a recruit on ditch angles, then to a provincial forum where a seller of lamps files a complaint over a smashed crate, and the magistrate quotes a jurist you remember from a scroll in Rome. You listen to a letter dictated by Pliny in Bithynia about a troublesome contractor, and you hear Trajan's reply in a tone that makes prudence sound like style. You watch an Egyptian scribe note a birth date in regnal years on papyrus that will outlast the hand that writes it. The empire you live in is not a map, it is a habit. And yet, the habit had a beginning. It began with a city discovering that law without force is theater, and force without law is fire, and deciding, reluctantly, to appoint a choreographer. The Republic's inventions, assemblies, magistrates, juries, vetoes, did not vanish, they learned new roles. The empire's inventions, Imperium Maius, the fiscus, standing legions, the post, did not erase old virtues, they taught them to travel. The formation produced the expansion taught the formation how to survive itself. By the time someone carves SPQR on a Spanish bridge, the letters mean Senate and people and also schedule and patrol and quiet roads. If you need a single sentence to stand where all our pages tried to, Rome moved from many loud hands on many short levers to one light hand on the main switch, and for a human lifetime or two the lights stayed on. The costs were real, the calm was, too. You walk home under an aqueduct Augustus paid for and think, not for the first time, that a stable sky is a gift, even if you know the taxes that hired it. Let the clamor dim until it becomes a steady hush, like the breath of a sleeping city under a generous aqueduct. Picture a straight Roman road dissolving into evening, milestones turning pale as bones, cart ruts softening, a patrol's sandal crunch drifting away until it's only suggestion. The arguments have been filed, the edicts rolled and tied, the lictor's rods hung neatly where wood remembers grip. Somewhere a bathhouse exhales its last warm mist, somewhere a baker slides the final loaf across a clean table and tucks the cloth as if covering a child. Breathe with the empire's slow cadence, into a count of 4, as if stepping from paving stone to paving stone. Hold for a small pause, like a magistrate before a measured word, and out to a long, unhurried 6, the way a river leaves a bridge with gratitude. Imagine distant forts blinking friendly lamps along a frontier that has agreed, for tonight, to be a line and not a question. Imagine tablets drying on shelves, ink set, decisions content to wait until morning. No trumpet calls, no messengers urgent in the lane. Only the quiet authority of schedules that will keep their promises after you sleep. Let your thoughts organize themselves like a legion breaking camp. The heavy worries stowed deep, the small ones bundled, the rest left behind for the next sunrise to surprise with how light they feel. You are not undisciplined now, you are on leave. The good roads will still be there when you return. The calendar ticks without your help. The world is willing to move its freight 1 hour later in your honor. Another breath, and the marble cools, and the night takes on that woolen texture that forgives. You may drift across provinces as easily as a courier with the right seal, down into fields that smell of cut hay and distant sea. A last breath out, longer than habit, and the lamps in the mind's forum wink once and lower themselves. Peace, like policy done well, is quiet. Let it do its work.